They called him the Ghost of Granite Ridge, a man who spoke to no one, needed no one, until two silent girls appeared at his gate like snow that wouldn't melt. When they vanished into the unforgiving Wyoming mountains, Caleb Rourke faced a choice that would shatter 20 years of solitude. Ride away as he always had, or follow footprints so small they barely marked the frozen earth. What he found in that abandoned cabin would bind him to a promise fiercer than any he'd made to the living, and to enemies who believed children were easier to bury than truth. Welcome to a story of survival, sacrifice, and the family we choose when blood fails us. If this tale moves you, let me know you're here. Drop a comment with your city below so I can see how far across this country our story travels. Hit that like button and let's begin. The November wind cut through Granite Ridge like a blade seeking bone. Caleb Rourke had lived in these mountains long enough to read weather the way other men read newspapers, and this morning's sky promised cruelty. Dark clouds gathered above the peaks like wolves circling prey, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees since dawn. He should have been checking his trap lines, should have been securing the cabin before the storm hit. Instead, Caleb found himself doing what he'd done every morning for the past 3 weeks, riding past Martha Henley's roadside inn with his jaw set and his eyes scanning the gate. They were there again. Two small figures huddled against the wooden fence, wrapped in shawls too thin for the season. The twin girls couldn't have been more than 7 years old, their faces pale as birch bark, their bodies so still they might have been carved from the same wood as the gate they leaned against. Caleb's mare, Sable, slowed without being told. The horse had learned her rider's rhythms over 15 years together, knew when his attention snagged on something he couldn't name. The girls never called out, never waved. They simply sat there each morning as travelers passed, prospectors heading into the high country, freight wagons bound for the mining camps, the occasional family relocating to one of the valley settlements. Some folks tossed them bread crusts or withered apples. Most pretended not to see them at all. Caleb had been among the latter group until last week, when he'd made the mistake of meeting the eyes of the one on the left. She'd looked at him with an expression that hollowed out his chest, not pleading, not hopeful, just aware. As if she'd already learned that the world was a place where children went hungry and no one came. He'd turned away and ridden on, but the image followed him back to his cabin like a debt unpaid. Now watching them from astride Sable, Caleb noticed details his mountain-trained eyes couldn't ignore. The girls were thinner than they'd been even a week ago, their cheekbones sharp beneath skin that hadn't seen enough sun or food. Their dresses, though clean, had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to distinguish from the patches. One girl's left shoe had a sole that flapped loose with each small movement, but it was their stillness that troubled him most. Children weren't meant to be that quiet, that contained. Even hungry ones usually fidgeted, whispered to each other, showed some spark of the wildness that childhood ought to hold. These two sat like they were already ghosts. "You planning to adopt them, or you just gonna stare?" The voice came from behind him, rough as tree bark and twice as unwelcoming. Caleb didn't need to turn to know it was Pete Garson, a trapper who worked the northern ridges and had a reputation for being half-wild himself. "Didn't ask for your opinion, Pete." "Don't recall offering one, just making an observation." Pete rode up alongside him on a mule that looked as disagreeable as its owner. "Those girls been there near about a month now. Nobody knows where they came from, and Martha Henley ain't saying. Feeds them her scraps when she's got any, but times are lean up here." Caleb studied the girls more closely. Now that Pete mentioned it, there was something odd about their presence at the inn. Martha ran a decent enough establishment, kept travelers fed and sheltered, but she wasn't known for charity. If these children had been dumped on her doorstep, she'd have sent them to the territorial orphanage in Cheyenne weeks ago. Unless there was a reason she couldn't. "They got people?" Caleb asked. "If they did, you think they'd be sitting in the cold begging strangers for food?" Pete spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Storm's coming. Those girls don't find shelter soon. They won't see another sunrise." The words landed in Caleb's gut like a rock through ice. He knew Pete was right. This wasn't going to be one of those brief November squalls that blew through and left an inch of snow. This was the real thing, the kind of storm that sealed the high country until spring and killed anything caught unprepared. "Martha should take them inside," Caleb muttered. "Should do a lot of things. But Martha's got her own troubles. Husband drinks away more than they make, and she's feeding half the deadbeats in the territory on credit that'll never get paid. Pete gathered his reins. World's full of hard luck, Rourke. Can't save everyone. He rode on, leaving Caleb alone with his conscience and the two silent girls who still hadn't moved. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow. Sable shifted beneath him, anxious to get home before the weather turned. Caleb touched his heels to her flanks, ready to ride past as he'd done every morning. Then one of the girls coughed, a wet, rattling sound that spoke of illness taking root in a body too weak to fight it. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. He'd spent 20 years in these mountains learning how to live alone, how to need nothing from the settlements except supplies and information. He'd built a life stripped down to essentials: shelter, warmth, food, survival. The complications that came with caring about people, with letting anyone close enough to matter. He'd walked away from all that the day he buried his wife and daughter in Pennsylvania soil and rode west without looking back. The mountains had saved him then, given him a place where silence was expected and the past stayed buried under snow that never fully melted. But that cough. Caleb swore under his breath, a vicious string of words that would have gotten him thrown out of any respectable establishment. Then he swung down from Sable and tied her to the fence post. The girls watched him approach with eyes that held no expectation. Up close, he could see they were identical. Same heart-shaped faces, same auburn hair, same gray eyes that seemed too old for their small bodies. But there were subtle differences. One held herself slightly straighter, her chin lifted in unconscious defiance. The other leaned against her sister with a weariness that went deeper than simple fatigue. "You got names?" Caleb asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. The straighter one spoke first. "I'm Mara. This is Elin." Her voice was clear despite the cold, with an accent that wasn't quite local. Montana, maybe, or one of the northern territories. "Where's your folks?" "Inside." Mara's hand tightened on her sister's shoulder. "Mama's sick." "And your pa?" "Don't have one." The simple statement carried weights Caleb recognized, the tone of a child who'd learned not to expect what other children took for granted. "Martha know you're out here?" "She knows." "And she just lets you freeze?" "We ain't freezing." But even as Mara said it, Elin shivered so hard her teeth chattered. The sick girl's lips had taken on a bluish tinge that Caleb had seen before, the color that came before frostbite, before the body started shutting down to protect itself. Caleb looked up at the inn. It was a 2-story structure with a sagging porch and windows that glowed with firelight. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys, promising warmth that these children weren't being offered. "Your ma know you're out here begging?" Mara's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. "Mama don't know much these days." The words held more truth than a child should have to speak. Caleb had heard that tone before, in field hospitals during the war, the voice of someone watching death take its time with a loved one. "How sick is she?" "Sick enough." Elin coughed again, the sound worsening. Her small body convulsed with the effort, and when she pulled her hand away from her mouth, Caleb saw the dark stain on her palm. Blood. The sight made his decision for him. "Get up," he said, more command than request. "Both of you." Mara's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Because I'm taking you inside where it's warm. Martha won't. I don't give a damn what Martha will or won't do. Your sister's coughing blood, and there's a storm coming that'll kill anyone fool enough to sit outside in it." Caleb crouched down to their level, meeting Mara's suspicious gaze head on. "I ain't asking permission. I'm telling you what's going to happen. Now get up." For a long moment, Mara stared at him, weighing, measuring, trying to determine if the stranger represented help or just another kind of danger. Caleb held her gaze, letting her see whatever she needed to see. Finally, she nodded and helped her sister stand. Elin's legs nearly gave out, but Caleb caught her before she fell. The girl weighed almost nothing, all sharp bones and fragile joints beneath the threadbare dress. He lifted her easily, settling her against his chest with the same care he'd once used carrying his own daughter when she fell asleep by the fire. The memory came sharp and unexpected, cutting through 20 years of careful forgetting. Caleb shoved it down, buried it where it belonged, and focused on the present problem. "Come on," he told Mara, who watched him with eyes that trusted nothing. Let's get your ma and figure out what happens next. He carried Elin up the inn's front steps, with Mara trailing behind like a shadow. The porch boards creaked under his weight, announcing their arrival before he could knock. The door opened before his knuckles touched wood. Martha Henley stood in the doorway, 45 years old and hard as the mountains that surrounded her establishment. She'd been pretty once. Caleb could see the ghost of it in her bone structure. But years of hardship had carved away everything soft, leaving only angles and wariness. Rourke. She didn't sound surprised to see him, just resigned. I was wondering when someone would finally grow a conscience. The girl's sick, Caleb said flatly. Where's their mother? Martha's expression tightened. She glanced at Mara, then back to Caleb, and something passed across her face that might have been guilt, or grief, or simple exhaustion. Upstairs, last room on the right. She stepped aside to let them enter. But you should know. Should know what? Martha's voice dropped low enough that Mara couldn't hear. Their ma's dying, Rourke, has been for weeks. I tried to help, but she's got the wasting sickness. Seen it before, starts in the lungs, spreads to everything else. Nothing stops it. Caleb looked down at the girl in his arms. Elin had closed her eyes, her breathing shallow and rapid against his chest. How long? Days. Maybe less. Martha's voice carried the weight of someone delivering news she'd given too many times. I couldn't turn them out, not with winter coming, but I couldn't take them in proper either. My husband would have... She trailed off, but Caleb understood the unfinished sentence. He'd heard stories about Roy Henley, how the man drank away his wife's earnings and had a temper that came out in fists when the bottle ran dry. The girls, Caleb said. They know? They know enough. Smart ones, those two. Too smart for their own good, maybe. Martha looked at Mara again, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. I've been feeding them what I can spare, but it ain't enough. And now with this storm... Take me to their mother, Caleb said. Martha led him through the inn's common room, a space that smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and the ghost of meals long eaten. Two miners sat at a corner table nursing whiskey, and an older woman dozed in a chair by the fire. None of them looked up as Caleb passed. The stairs creaked under his boots. Upstairs, the hallway was dim and close, lit only by a single lamp that cast more shadows than light. Martha stopped at the last door, her hand on the knob. Her name's Catherine Ross, she said quietly. She came through here 6 weeks ago, heading west. Said she was meeting someone in Oregon, but she got sick before she made it past the first mountain. Been here ever since, getting worse. The girl's father? Never mentioned him. Never mentioned anyone except the girls. Martha pushed open the door. She ain't conscious much these days. The room beyond was small and spare. A single bed, a chair, a washstand with a cracked basin. And on the bed, barely visible beneath piled blankets, lay a woman who looked more like a skeleton than a living person. Catherine Ross couldn't have been more than 30, but illness had aged her beyond recognition. Her skin stretched tight over bones that pressed against fabric, and her breathing came in shallow, labored gasps that spoke of lungs drowning from the inside. Her eyes were closed, her auburn hair, the same shade as her daughter's, spread across the pillow like spilled rust. Mara pushed past Caleb and Martha, moving to the bedside with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been serving as nurse for too long. She dipped a cloth in the basin, wrung it out, and pressed it to her mother's forehead with a tenderness that made Caleb's chest ache. Mama, she whispered. We're back. Catherine's eyes fluttered open. They were gray like her daughter's, but filmed with fever and confusion. For a moment she seemed not to recognize anyone. Then her gaze found Mara, and something cleared. Baby, she breathed, the word barely audible. You shouldn't... Outside. We're fine, Mama. We're inside now. Mara looked up at Caleb, her expression fierce. You can put Elin on the chair. Caleb did as instructed, settling the younger girl carefully. Elin's eyes opened briefly, found her sister, then closed again. Her breathing had worsened, each inhale now accompanied by a wheeze that scraped against Caleb's nerves like a file on metal. Mrs. Ross, he said, moving closer to the bed. My name's Caleb Rourke. I know who you are. Catherine's voice was thread-thin but clear. Martha. Told me. The mountain man who keeps to himself. Yes, ma'am. You got family? The question caught him off guard. No, ma'am. Not anymore. Catherine's eyes searched his face, looking for something she seemed to find. Then you understand what it is to be alone. I do. My girls? Another fit of coughing seized her, violent enough to make her whole body convulse. Mara held her mother's hand through it, murmuring soft reassurances that broke Caleb's heart for their practiced familiarity. When the coughing finally subsided, Catherine lay gasping, blood flecking her lips. Martha stepped forward with a clean cloth, wiping it away with a gentleness that surprised Caleb. Don't try to talk, Martha murmured. Save your strength. But Catherine shook her head, her grip tightening on Mara's hand with surprising strength. No time left for saving. She looked at Caleb again, and her eyes held the desperate clarity of someone racing against their own mortality. My girls need someone. The words hung in the air like a noose waiting to drop. Ma'am, there's territorial services. No. The single word came out fierce despite her weakness. No orphanages. No strangers. Another cough, shorter this time. They deserve better. Mama, don't, Mara said, her voice cracking for the first time. Don't talk like that. Have to, baby. Have to make sure. Catherine's gaze never left Caleb's face. You're a good man. Can see it. Martha sees it too. You don't know me, Caleb said roughly. Know enough. You came when others didn't. You care, even if you pretend not to. Her breathing grew more labored. Please, when I'm gone, don't let them take my babies. Don't let them be separated. Mrs. Ross, promise me. The demand carried the weight of a dying woman's last request. Caleb looked at Mara, who stared back with eyes that held too much knowledge for 7 years. He looked at Elin, unconscious in the chair with her sister's shawl tucked around her like armor against the cold. He looked at Martha, who nodded almost imperceptibly. A confirmation of something Catherine had said, though Caleb couldn't tell what. He thought of his cabin in the mountains, the silence he'd cultivated so carefully, the life stripped down to bare survival, free from complications and grief and the terrifying possibility of loss. He thought of turning away, of letting the territorial authorities handle this the way they handled all such problems, efficiently, impersonally, with forms filled out and children dispersed to wherever space existed. He thought of those 2 small figures at the gate, sitting in the cold with a stillness that spoke of hope already learned to be silent. All right, he heard himself say, the words coming from somewhere deeper than conscious choice. I promise. Catherine's expression transformed, relief so profound it looked like pain flooding across her wasted features. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you. She closed her eyes then, exhaustion claiming her. Within moments, her breathing settled into the rhythmic rasp of fevered sleep. Caleb stood frozen, the weight of what he'd just agreed to settling over him like stones piled on a chest. 20 years. He'd gone 20 years without letting anyone close enough to matter, without taking on responsibility for anything beyond his own survival. Now, with 5 words, he'd bound himself to 2 children he didn't know, in a situation he didn't understand, for reasons he couldn't quite name. You did a good thing, Martha said quietly. Did I? Caleb's voice came out harsh. Or did I just make a promise I can't keep? You'll keep it. Martha moved to check Catherine's pulse, her movements practiced. You're not the kind of man who breaks his word, even when he wishes he could. You don't know that. Don't I? She straightened, meeting his eyes. You've been riding past those girls for 3 weeks, Rourke. Fighting with yourself every morning, trying to convince yourself it wasn't your problem. But you kept riding past, kept looking, kept caring, even when you didn't want to. That's not a man who walks away. Caleb wanted to argue, but couldn't find the words, because Martha was right. He'd been fighting this pull since the first morning he'd seen the twins, had told himself a dozen different lies about why it wasn't his concern, why someone else would help, why getting involved was the last thing a man like him should do. And yet here he stood, having made a promise that would change everything. The storm, he said instead, grasping at practical concerns. It's coming fast. I need to get back to my cabin before it hits. Then go. Martha glanced at the girls. But know this, when Catherine passes, and it won't be long now, those children will need you. The territorial marshal comes through here every few weeks. If he finds orphaned children with no guardian, he'll take them regardless of any promise made to a dying woman. What are you saying? I'm saying you might want to think about where those girls will be safest when the time comes. Martha's expression hardened. And whether a cabin in the mountains is better than a marshal's wagon heading to Cheyenne. The implication was clear. If Caleb was going to honor his promise, he'd need to act before official channels got involved. Which meant, "You're suggesting I take them," he said flatly. "I'm suggesting you consider what you promised. Catherine asked you to keep them together, to keep them from strangers." Martha moved toward the door. "How you do that is your business, but I'll tell you true. Those girls have already lost too much. They don't need to lose each other too." She left then, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded final. Caleb stood in the dim room, listening to Catherine Ross's labored breathing and feeling the weight of his own words pressing down like the approaching storm. He looked at Mara, who hadn't moved from her mother's bedside, and at Elin, who slept with the shallow breathing of someone fighting illness in a body too weak for the battle. 2 children, strangers. A promise made to a dying woman. Everything he'd spent 20 years avoiding, wrapped up in 2 small packages that together probably didn't weigh as much as his winter supplies. "Mr. Rourke?" Mara's voice was quiet, carefully controlled. She still held her mother's hand, but she'd turned to look at him with eyes that saw too much. "What is it?" "You don't have to keep your promise. I know grown-ups say things to make dying people feel better. We won't hold it against you." The statement, delivered with such matter-of-fact resignation, hit Caleb harder than any accusation could have, because it revealed exactly what these children had learned about the world, that words were cheap, promises breakable, and the only person you could truly count on was yourself. "I keep my promises," he said, his voice rough, "even the ones I shouldn't make." "Why?" Mara asked. "We're nothing to you." "Your children, that's enough." It wasn't enough for anyone else. Caleb had no answer for that, because she was right. Every person who'd passed those girls at the gate for 3 weeks had made the same calculation he'd almost made. Not my problem, not my responsibility, someone else will help. "Well," he said finally, "I guess I'm not anyone else." Mara studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay." That single word carried more weight than Caleb was ready for. Acceptance, trust, the beginning of something he couldn't name and wasn't sure he wanted. He left the room before he could change his mind, his boots heavy on the stairs as he descended into the common room. The storm had arrived while he was upstairs. He could hear wind battering the windows and see snow beginning to fall in thick, heavy flakes. Martha stood at the bar, pouring whiskey into a glass with hands that trembled slightly. "You leaving?" she asked, without looking up. "Have to. Storm's here, and I need to secure my place before it gets worse. And the girls?" Caleb pulled his coat tighter, feeling the cold already seeping through the walls. "I'll come back. After the storm passes. Check on things. Catherine won't last that long." "I know." Martha finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You really mean to keep that promise?" "I do." "Even though it'll turn your whole life upside down?" "Yes." "Why?" Caleb thought about the answer, about his own daughter's face, forever 7 years old in his memory, about the way grief had driven him into these mountains 20 years ago, seeking isolation as both punishment and protection, about how seeing 2 small girls sitting in the cold had cracked something open inside him that he'd thought was sealed forever. "Because someone should," he said finally, "and it looks like I'm the one here to do it." He left before Martha could respond, stepping out into the storm that had transformed the world into a whiteout of wind and snow. Sable waited where he'd tied her, patient despite the weather, and he swung up into the saddle with practiced ease. The ride back to his cabin took twice as long as usual, the trail already obscured by drifting snow. But Sable knew the way even blind, and Caleb trusted her instincts more than his own eyes in weather like this. By the time they reached the cabin, the storm had become a full blizzard, the kind that killed travelers and buried landmarks beneath feet of snow. Caleb got Sable into her shelter, made sure she had feed and water, then fought his way through the wind to his own door. Inside, the cabin was exactly as he'd left it that morning, neat, spare, organized for a life of solitary efficiency. One chair at the table, one set of dishes on the shelf, one bed in the loft. A space built for a man alone, with no room for complications or company or the messy business of caring about anyone else. Caleb built up the fire, made coffee, and stood at the window watching the storm rage. The wind howled like something alive, and the snow fell so thick he couldn't see 10 feet beyond the glass. Somewhere out there in Martha Henley's inn, 2 small girls waited beside their dying mother, and he'd promised to keep them safe, to keep them together, to somehow fold them into a life that had no space for children or softness or the possibility of loss. He'd made an impossible promise. The question now was whether he'd find a way to keep it, or whether he'd become just another adult who'd taught those girls that words meant nothing and trust was for fools. The storm continued through the night and into the next day, burying the mountains under snow that would take weeks to fully melt. And in his cabin, Caleb Rourke stood at the window and wondered what the hell he was going to do when the weather finally cleared and it was time to honor his word. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of wind that screamed like the damned and snow that erased every trace of the world beyond Caleb's windows. He'd weathered worse, blizzards that lasted a week, cold snaps that froze whiskey solid in the bottle. But this time felt different. This time, he couldn't stop thinking about 2 small girls huddled in a drafty inn, watching their mother die while the mountains buried everything in white. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind finally died. Caleb woke to silence so complete it felt like a physical weight, then realized what it meant. He was at the window before full consciousness returned, looking out at a world transformed into something alien and beautiful and treacherous. The snow had drifted 15 feet high in places, sculpted by the wind into shapes that looked almost deliberate. The path to town, usually visible as a dark line through the trees, had vanished entirely. Even Sable's shelter was half buried, just the roof peak showing above the white. It would take hours to dig out, maybe a full day to make the trail passable, and every minute he delayed was a minute those girls spent without help. Caleb didn't bother with breakfast. He pulled on extra layers, strapped snowshoes to his boots, and started digging. By noon, he'd cleared enough to get Sable out and saddled. The mare snorted her displeasure at the deep snow, but she was mountain-bred and knew her job. They set out with the sun high and cold, following a route that Caleb had to navigate more by instinct than sight. The journey that normally took an hour stretched to 3. Twice, Sable nearly went down in drifts that hid fallen logs. Once, they had to backtrack half a mile when the trail ahead proved impassable. But Caleb had learned patience in these mountains, learned that rushing only got you killed, and so he let Sable pick her way carefully while he scanned constantly for landmarks. The inn appeared finally, its chimneys smoking thin and gray against the white landscape. But something was wrong. The front porch, usually swept clean by Martha's obsessive maintenance, was buried under snow. No tracks led to or from the building. The place looked abandoned, though Caleb could see movement behind one of the upstairs windows. He tied Sable to a post he had to dig out first, then climbed the buried steps to the door. It opened before he could knock. Martha stood there, and Caleb barely recognized her. The woman who'd faced him 3 days ago with weary competence now looked hollowed out, her eyes red-rimmed and her hair escaping its pins in wild tangles. "She's gone," Martha said without preamble. "Catherine. She passed the first night of the storm." The words landed with the dull finality of a coffin lid closing. Caleb had expected this, known it was coming, but hearing it confirmed still felt like taking a blow. "The girls?" "Upstairs. They won't leave the room." Martha's voice cracked. "I tried, Rourke. Tried to get them to come down, eat something, but they just sit there with her body and won't speak." Caleb pushed past her into the common room. It was empty except for Roy Henley, Martha's husband, who sat at the bar with a bottle and bloodshot eyes. The man looked up as Caleb entered, his expression hostile. "The mountain hermit finally shows up," Roy slurred, 3 days late and useless as always. "Roy, don't," Martha warned. "Don't what? Point out that this fool made promises he can't keep?" We got 2 orphans upstairs and a dead woman who needs burying, and where was he when it mattered? Roy took another drink. Off in his precious mountains, that's where. Caleb crossed the room in 3 strides. He grabbed Roy by the collar and hauled him off the bar stool with enough force to send the bottle crashing to the floor. "You want to run your mouth? Do it when I'm gone," Caleb said, his voice deadly quiet. "But right now, there are 2 children upstairs who've lost everything, and I don't have time for your drunk self-pity." He dropped Roy back onto the stool and turned to Martha. "Which room?" "Same as before, but Caleb—" She caught his arm as he headed for the stairs. "They've been sitting with the body for 3 days. It's not a good sight. I've seen dead before. Not like this, not children keeping vigil over their mother while she—" Martha's voice broke. "Just be gentle. They've been through enough." Caleb climbed the stairs with dread building in his chest. The hallway smelled of sickness and death, despite the cold that had slowed decay. He could hear voices coming from the end room, one voice, really, speaking in a low murmur that rose and fell like a prayer. He knocked softly. The murmuring stopped. "Mara, it's Caleb Rourke. I'm coming in." He opened the door slowly, giving them time to prepare for his presence. The room beyond was dim, curtains drawn against the daylight. It took his eyes a moment to adjust enough to make sense of the scene. Catherine Ross lay on the bed exactly as he'd last seen her, except now her stillness was absolute. Someone, Martha probably, had cleaned her face and folded her hands across her chest. She looked peaceful, but also impossibly small, as if death had somehow shrunk her down to child size. Mara sat in the chair beside the bed, holding her mother's cold hand. Elin lay curled on the floor nearby, wrapped in blankets, her breathing still that awful wheeze Caleb remembered from 3 days ago. "She's not waking up," Mara said without looking at him. Her voice was flat, empty of everything except a terrible understanding. "I've been telling her about the storm, about the snow, about all the things she's missing, but she won't wake up." Caleb moved closer, his boots loud on the wooden floor. "Mara, I know she's dead." The girl finally looked up, and her eyes were dry but hollow. "I'm not stupid. I know what dead looks like. But Elin doesn't understand yet, and I don't know how to tell her." Caleb crouched down beside the chair, bringing himself to Mara's level. "How long has Elin been on the floor?" "Since yesterday. She got too weak to sit up." Mara's hand tightened on her mother's. "She keeps asking when Mama's going to get better. Keeps saying she'll be good if Mama just wakes up." The words gutted him. Caleb looked at the small form on the floor, saw how Elin's chest rose and fell with labored effort, heard the rattle in her lungs that spoke of pneumonia settling in. "She needs a doctor," he said. "We don't have money for doctors." "I wasn't asking about money." Caleb stood, making a decision that felt both inevitable and impossible. "We're leaving. Both of you, right now. We can't leave Mama. Your mother's gone, Mara. She's not here anymore, and sitting with her body won't bring her back." The harshness of his own words made him wince, but sometimes truth had to be delivered blunt. "But your sister is still here, still alive, and if we don't get her warm and fed and treated, she won't be much longer." Mara stared at him, her young face warring between denial and acceptance. "Where would we go?" "My cabin. It's got a good stove, plenty of food, and I've got supplies that'll help with Elin's breathing." He moved toward the girl on the floor. "Martha can see to your mother's burial. She'll do it proper, I promise. But right now, you need to choose. Stay here with the dead, or come with me and save the living." It was brutal putting it that way, but Caleb had learned long ago that children often understood harsh truths better than gentle lies. Mara proved him right. She looked at her mother one last time, bent to kiss the cold forehead, then released the hand she'd been holding. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll go." Caleb gathered Elin from the floor. The girl barely stirred, her skin burning with fever despite the room's cold. He could feel every bone in her small body, feel how the illness had wasted what little reserve she'd had. She needed help soon, or the choice would be made for them. "Martha!" he called, carrying Elin toward the door. Mara followed, moving like someone in a dream. Martha appeared at the top of the stairs, took one look at the girl in his arms, and paled. "Sweet Jesus, she's worse." "She needs medicine. What do you have?" "Nothing strong enough for pneumonia. You'd need to get to town, find Doc Morrison. That's a day's ride in good weather. She doesn't have a day. Caleb adjusted his grip on Elin. I've got yarrow and willow bark back at my place. It'll help with the fever, but I need to get her there now. Take my wagon, Martha said immediately. It's got runners for the snow and there's blankets in the back. I'll hitch it up while you get the girls ready. What about... Caleb glanced back at the room where Catherine's body lay. I'll handle it. I'll see she gets buried proper, say words over her, mark the grave. Martha's eyes glistened. It's the least I can do after letting those babies suffer for so long. You did what you could. Did I? Or did I just make excuses because it was easier than standing up to Roy? She shook her head. Don't matter now. Get those girls safe. That's what matters. 20 minutes later, Caleb had the wagon loaded and the girls bundled in back under every blanket Martha could spare. Mara sat with her sister's head in her lap, stroking the fevered hair with a tenderness that made Caleb's throat tight. Elin remained barely conscious, her lips moving in silent conversation with phantoms only she could see. There's food in the basket, Martha said, handing up a wicker container that smelled of bread and smoked meat. And I packed some of Catherine's things, clothes for the girls, a few belongings, thought they might want them. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just save that child. Martha stepped back, hugging herself against the cold. And Rourke, that promise you made, I think Catherine knew exactly what she was doing when she asked it of you. I think she saw something in you that you don't see in yourself. Caleb didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded and snapped the reins. The horses leaned into their harness, and the wagon lurched forward through snow that came up to the hubs. The journey back took even longer than his ride out. The wagon was heavier than Sable alone, and the runners kept catching on hidden obstacles. Twice, Caleb had to get down and dig them free. Each delay felt like stealing minutes from Elin's dwindling time. But finally, as the sun touched the western peaks, his cabin came into view. It looked exactly as he'd left it that morning. Small, solid, solitary. A place built for one, now about to become home for three. He pulled the wagon as close to the door as the drifts allowed, then carried Elin inside while Mara followed. The cabin was cold, the fire long dead, but Caleb had built the place well. The walls kept out the worst of the wind, and the stove held heat like a miser held gold. He laid Elin on his own bed, the only bed, and immediately set about building up the fire. Mara stood uncertainly in the middle of the room, holding the basket of food and looking lost. There's a chest by the wall, Caleb said as he worked. Top shelf has clean linens. Bring me several and the brown bottle on the shelf above the stove. Mara moved to obey, her efficiency suggesting she was used to following instructions in a crisis. She brought the items, then stood watching as Caleb peeled away Elin's sweat-soaked dress and wrapped her in dry cloth. The girl's breathing had worsened during the trip, each inhale now a visible struggle, each exhale accompanied by a sound like tearing fabric. Caleb had heard that sound before, in field hospitals during the war. It was the sound of lungs filling with fluid, of the body slowly drowning from the inside. He mixed willow bark tea, added a measure from the brown bottle, laudanum carefully measured, and managed to get some down Elin's throat. She swallowed reflexively, coughed, then settled into an uneasy stillness. Is she going to die? Mara asked, her voice small. Caleb wanted to lie, to offer false comfort, but he'd promised to keep these girls safe, and safety included truth, even when it hurt. I don't know, he said. She's very sick. The fever's high, and her lungs are bad, but she's young, and she's a fighter, and sometimes that's enough. Mama said that too, that she was a fighter. Mara's voice cracked. But she died anyway. Caleb stood, his knees protesting. He looked at this 7-year-old girl who'd been forced to grow up too fast, who'd kept vigil over her dying mother for 3 days, who now faced the possibility of losing her sister too. Come here, he said gruffly. Mara hesitated, then moved closer. Caleb put his hand on her shoulder, awkward, unpracticed, but the best he could manage after 20 years of touching no one. Your mother was sick with something that can't be fought. Something that eats you from inside until there's nothing left to fight with. He kept his voice steady, factual. Your sister has pneumonia. It's bad, but it's different. It can be fought, and it can be beat. She's got medicine now, warmth, food. That's more than she had 3 days ago. Because of you, Mara said quietly. Because I made a promise. And because... He stopped, unsure how to finish that sentence. Because what? Because he'd seen them and couldn't look away? Because some part of him that he thought was long dead had woken up and demanded he act? Because you're here, he finished finally, and I don't leave behind people who need help. Mara looked up at him with those two old eyes. Are we really going to stay here? With you? For now. Until Elend's better, at least. After that, Caleb trailed off, realizing he hadn't thought past the immediate crisis. What happened after? Where did two orphaned girls go when they had no family, no money, no options? The answer came with uncomfortable clarity. They stayed with the man who'd promised their dying mother he'd keep them safe. After that, we'll figure it out, he said instead. That night, Caleb learned what it meant to care for a desperately ill child. Elend's fever spiked around midnight, sending her into delirium. She cried out for her mother in a voice that scraped at his soul, thrashing in the bed with strength she shouldn't have possessed. He held her down gently but firmly, pressing cool cloths to her forehead while Mara whispered comfort in her sister's ear. The hours crawled past in a blur of medicine doses, wet cloths, and the awful sound of Elend fighting for each breath. Dawn came gray and cold. Elend finally fell into an exhausted sleep, her fever slightly lower, but her breathing still labored. Caleb sat slumped in his chair, every muscle aching, and realized Mara had fallen asleep on the floor beside the bed, her hand still gripping her sister's. He stood, his body protesting, and looked around his cabin. The basket for Martha sat unopened on the table. Snow had drifted against the windows during the night. The fire needed tending. 100 small tasks demanded attention, but all Caleb could do was stare at the two small girls who'd upended his carefully constructed isolation in the space of 4 days. He'd built this life to avoid exactly this, the vulnerability that came with caring, the terror of potential loss, the responsibility of other lives depending on his choices. He'd convinced himself that solitude was safety, that needing no one meant risking nothing. But standing there in the weak dawn light, watching Mara sleep with her hand on her dying sister, Caleb understood the lie he'd been telling himself. Safety wasn't the absence of risk. It was the willingness to risk everything for something that mattered. And somehow, without him noticing when it happened, these two lost girls had become something that mattered. The next 2 days passed in a fog of nursing care and cautious hope. Elend's fever broke on the second morning, leaving her weak as water but conscious and aware. She took broth from a spoon, drank the medicine without fighting, and even managed a small smile when Mara told her they were staying in a mountain cabin. "With the mountain man?" Elend whispered, her voice barely audible. "His name is Mr. Rourke," Mara corrected. "And yes, he's helping us." Elend's gray eyes found Caleb across the room. "Thank you," she said simply. Those 2 words, delivered in a voice like wind through grass, hit harder than any gratitude Caleb had ever received, because they came without expectation of anything beyond what he'd already given, without the adult complications of debt and obligation. Just simple thanks from a child who understood she'd been saved. "You're welcome," he said, his voice rough. As Elend slowly improved, Caleb began to understand the full scope of what he'd taken on. 2 children meant noise where there'd been silence, questions where there'd been solitude, needs that extended far beyond his own simple survival. Mara proved endlessly curious about everything in the cabin, asking about his traps, his tools, his books, the scars on his hands. Elend, when she felt better, wanted stories about the mountains, about animals, about anything that distracted from the grief that still shadowed her eyes whenever she thought no one was watching. They needed clothes. The things Martha had packed were worn threadbare. They needed better food than his bachelor supplies. They needed 100 things he'd never considered, and each one represented a choice: send them away to people better equipped to provide, or figure out how to become the person who could give them what they needed. The choice was never really in doubt, though Caleb fought it anyway. On the 5th night since bringing them home, he sat at his table after the girls had fallen asleep and stared at the facts he could no longer avoid. 2 orphans. No legal guardian. A promise made but not formalized. And somewhere out there, a territorial marshal who'd eventually hear about Catherine Ross's death and come asking questions about her daughters. If that happened, if official channels got involved before Caleb established some legal claim to the girls, they'd be taken regardless of any deathbed promise. They'd be separated. Twins were rarely kept together in the orphanage system, where children were parceled out based on available space rather than family bonds. They'd disappear into a system that ground up children and spit out survivors if you were lucky. Caleb couldn't let that happen, which meant he needed to act before the marshal came asking questions. The next morning, he made his decision. "Mara," he called as the girl helped her sister eat breakfast. "I need to go into town. Probably be gone most of the day." Mara's head snapped up, fear flashing across her face. "You're leaving?" "Just for the day. I'll be back before dark." He saw her disbelief and understood it. Every adult in her life had made promises about returning, and most had broken them. "I swear it. I'm coming back." "What if something happens? What if Elin gets sick again?" "She won't. Her fever's been gone 3 days, and she's keeping food down. But if anything worries you, there's a neighbor about 2 miles east, old trapper named Pete Garson. Can't miss his place. You tell him Caleb Rourke sent you, and he'll help." Mara still looked uncertain, but she nodded. "What are you going to town for?" Caleb hesitated, then decided truth was better than evasion. "To see a lawyer about making sure you and Elin can stay here. Legal-like." Understanding dawned in Mara's eyes. Understanding and something that might have been hope. "You mean you want to keep us? For real?" "I made a promise to your mother. I intend to keep it." He pulled on his coat, suddenly uncomfortable with the weight of her stare. "That means making it official, making it so no one can take you away." "Why?" The question was soft but intense. "You don't know us. We're nothing but trouble and expense. Why would you tie yourself to us?" Caleb looked at her, this fierce, protective, too wise child who'd been forced to be an adult before she'd had a chance to be young. He thought about all the complicated answers he could give, all the philosophical justifications and moral reasoning. But in the end, the truth was simpler than that. "Because someone should," he said, "and I'm the one here to do it." He left before Mara could respond, stepping out into a morning so clear and cold it burned his lungs. The ride to town took 3 hours through snow that was finally starting to settle and pack. By the time Caleb reached the main street, the sun was high, and the settlement was awake with the business of surviving another mountain winter. The lawyer's office sat above the general store, accessed by an outside staircase that Caleb climbed with growing reluctance. He'd never had much use for legal types. Too many words, too many complications. But this required words and complications, so he'd swallow his discomfort and do what needed doing. The lawyer turned out to be a young man named Thomas Brennan, fresh from some Eastern law school and still naive enough to believe justice and law were the same thing. "Mr. Rourke," Brennan said, gesturing to a chair across from his cluttered desk. "What can I help you with?" Caleb sat, his hat in his hands. "I need to become guardian to 2 orphaned girls. Need to know how to make it legal so no one can challenge it." Brennan's expression shifted to professional interest. "These girls, are they family?" "No, their mother died last week. Asked me to look after them before she passed." "I see. And their father?" "Dead or gone. Woman never mentioned him." "Any other living relatives?" "None that I know of." Brennan pulled out paper and began making notes. "The process is relatively straightforward for territorial guardianship. You'd need to petition the court, demonstrate means to provide for the children, and undergo a character review. Given the circumstances, children with no other options, dying mother's request, it's likely the judge would approve, especially if there are witnesses to the mother's wishes." "How long does it take?" 6 to 8 weeks, typically. The court has to post notice, allow time for any relatives to come forward, conduct the character review. "I don't have 8 weeks," Caleb interrupted. "The territorial marshal makes rounds every few weeks. If he finds out about orphaned children before I have legal standing, he'll take them." "That's the law, Mr. Rourke. Orphaned children become wards of the territory until proper guardianship is established." "The law's got no place taking children from the only home they've got." Caleb's voice hardened. "Isn't there a faster way?" Brennan studied him thoughtfully. "There is one option, though it's unconventional. If you could prove immediate need, say one of the children required ongoing medical care that would be interrupted by removal, the judge might grant emergency temporary guardianship. That would give you legal standing while the full petition is processed. One of them just recovered from pneumonia, still needs supervision and medicine. That might qualify. Brennan made more notes. But I have to ask, Mr. Rourke, why are you doing this? Taking on 2 children is a significant commitment, especially for a man living alone in the mountains. What's your interest in these girls? The question touched something raw in Caleb's chest. He thought about how to answer, about all the reasons he'd been telling himself over the past week. But when he spoke, only one truth came out. My own daughter would have been about their age, he said quietly. If she'd lived. And I remember what it felt like watching her die, knowing there was nothing I could do to save her. These girls lost their mother the same way, slowly, helplessly. But they're still here, still alive. And maybe I can't save everyone, but I can save them. Brennan's expression softened. I'm sorry for your loss. It was a long time ago. Caleb stood, unable to sit still with old grief stirring. Can you drop the papers? I can. It'll take a few days to prepare the petition and schedule the hearing. In the meantime, I'd advise keeping the girls out of sight. If the marshal does come around asking questions, it's better he doesn't know they're with you until the legal protections are in place. They're in my cabin 2 hours from anywhere. No one's going to stumble across them. Good. Brennan extended his hand. I'll send word when everything's ready. Caleb shook the offered hand, then left before the lawyer could ask more questions about his past. Some doors were better left closed. Some grief better left buried. He stopped at the general store on his way out of town, spending more money than he'd intended on fabric for dresses, warmer clothes, books, and other supplies 2 girls would need. The storekeeper, an older woman named Mrs. Chen, didn't ask questions, just added up the total with knowing eyes that saw more than Caleb wanted to reveal. Those for the Ross girls? She asked as she wrapped his purchases. Caleb's hand froze on his coins. How'd you know about them? Small territory, Mr. Rourke. Word travels. Heard you took them in after Catherine passed. Heard you've been caring for the sick one. Mrs. Chen pushed the wrapped parcels across the counter. That's good of you. Those girls need someone. They need a lot more than someone like me can give. Don't sell yourself short. From what I hear, you're exactly what they need. Someone steady, someone who doesn't quit when things get hard. She smiled. Children don't need perfect. They just need present. Caleb took his purchases without responding, uncomfortable with praise he didn't feel he'd earned. But as he loaded the wagon and started the long ride home, Mrs. Chen's words stayed with him. Children don't need perfect. They just need present. He'd spent 20 years being absent from life, from connection, from everything that hurt. Maybe presence was all these girls really needed. Maybe just showing up day after day was enough. The cabin came into view as the sun touched the western peaks, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin gray line. Caleb felt something unfamiliar loosen in his chest, relief at coming home, eagerness to see if the girls were all right, the strange warmth of knowing someone waited for his return. He'd been gone less than a day, but everything had changed. He wasn't alone anymore. Mara appeared in the doorway as he pulled up, her face flooding with relief when she saw him. You came back. Said I would, didn't I? Caleb climbed down, started unloading parcels. How's your sister? Better. She ate real food today, not just broth, and she walked around the cabin without getting dizzy. Mara watched him unload with curious eyes. What's all that? Supplies, things you'll need. He handed her a parcel. That one's got fabric in it. Figured you could use new dresses. Mara took the package like it might break, her expression unreadable. You bought us dresses? And books, and warmer clothes, and... He stopped, suddenly uncertain. Had he overstepped? Bought the wrong things? He had no idea what girls needed, had been guessing based on vague memories of his daughter. If it's not right, we can... Mara threw her arms around his waist, the package forgotten on the ground. The hug lasted only a moment before she pulled back, embarrassed, but it was enough to tell Caleb he hadn't been wrong. Thank you, she whispered. You're welcome. He gathered the dropped package, his chest tight. Let's get this inside before it gets any colder. That night, After the girls had gone to bed, wearing new nightgowns and clutching new blankets, Caleb sat at his table and realized something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't his cabin anymore. It was their cabin. This wasn't his life. It was the life they were building together, day by unexpected day. And for the first time in 20 years, the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like loneliness. But the laughter from the loft where the girls whispered to each other in the dark, that felt like something worth keeping. Something woke Caleb 3 nights later. Not sound exactly, but the absence of it. The particular quality of silence that meant someone was awake and trying not to be heard. He descended from the loft where he'd moved after giving the girls his bed, moving quietly through the darkness. Moonlight streaming through the window revealed Mara sitting at the table, her small form wrapped in one of the new blankets, staring at something spread before her. "Can't sleep?" Caleb asked softly. Mara startled, her hand moving to cover whatever she'd been looking at. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." He moved closer, saw she'd been examining the contents of the basket Martha had packed, her mother's belongings. A tarnished locket lay open on the table, revealing 2 tiny portraits. "That your parents?" Mara nodded, her finger tracing the painted faces. "Mama kept this always. Said it was the only picture of Papa she had. He died before Elin and I were born. Logging accident up in Montana." Caleb studied the portraits. The woman was clearly Catherine, younger and healthier. The man beside her had kind eyes and a strong jaw, his hand resting on Catherine's shoulder in the formal pose photography required. "He looks like a good man." Mama said he was the best man she ever knew, said he made her laugh even when times were hard. Mara's voice wavered. She never stopped missing him. Even after 5 years, she'd still talk to his picture sometimes when she thought we weren't listening. "That's love," Caleb said quietly, "the kind that doesn't end just because someone's gone." "Is that what you had? With your daughter's mother?" The question caught him off guard. He'd mentioned his daughter to the lawyer, but not to the girls. "How'd you know about that?" "You talk in your sleep sometimes. Not words exactly, just names. Sarah and Emma." Mara looked up at him. "Were those their names?" Caleb found himself nodding before he decided whether to answer. "Sarah was my wife. Emma was our daughter. She was 7 when she died. Same age as you." "What happened to them?" For 20 years, Caleb had refused to speak those names aloud, had buried the story so deep he'd almost convinced himself it was someone else's grief. But sitting in the moonlit cabin with this fierce, hurting child who'd lost her own mother, the words came easier than they should have. Scarlet fever. Went through our town in Pennsylvania like wildfire. Emma caught it first, then Sarah got it nursing her. He stared at his hands, remembering how helpless they'd been, how useless. "I watched them both die within 3 days of each other. Couldn't save either one." "That's why you left." "That's why I ran," Caleb corrected. "Told myself I was starting over, but really I was just hiding. Figured if I never let anyone close again, I'd never have to watch them die." "Did it work?" "For 20 years I thought it did. Then 2 girls showed up freezing at a gate, and I learned there's some things you can't run from forever." Mara was quiet for a long moment, her fingers still touching the locket. "Are you sorry that you helped us?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "Scared sometimes, worried I'll fail you somehow, but not sorry." "Good, because Elin and we decided we're going to stay. Even after she's all better, even if other people come around asking questions. We're staying with you." "That might not be your choice to make, Mara. There's laws about orphan children, systems in place. We don't care about systems. Mama chose you. She looked at you and saw something that made her trust you with us. And Mama was smart about people." Mara closed the locket with a soft snap. "Besides, you're the only one who came when it mattered. Everyone else just walked past." The simple faith in her voice humbled him. "Your mother didn't really know me. She made that choice based on hope more than fact." "Maybe, but you made a choice too. You could have walked away after Mama died, told yourself you tried. Instead, you brought us here, sat up with Elin for 3 days straight when she was dying, bought us dresses and books." Mara met his eyes squarely. Those aren't the actions of a man who wants to be left alone. You're too smart for 7 years old. Mama used to say that. Said I got all the serious and Elin got all the sunshine. Her expression softened. I miss her. I miss her so much it feels like there's a hole in my chest. I know, and it won't stop hurting, not for a long time, but it changes. Gets easier to carry, if not lighter. How long did it take? For you? Caleb thought about that. I'm still carrying it, but it doesn't feel like drowning anymore, more like remembering. Sad remembering, but not the kind that makes you want to stop breathing. Mara nodded slowly, processing this. Then she said something that stopped Caleb's heart. Elin asked me today if we could call you Papa. I told her it was too soon, that we shouldn't push. But is it? Too soon? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Caleb wasn't ready to face. Papa. A word he hadn't heard directed at him in 20 years. A word that came with expectations and responsibilities and the terrifying vulnerability of mattering to someone who could be lost. Let's just see how things go, he said carefully. One day at a time. No need to rush into names and labels. Okay. Mara didn't sound disappointed, just accepting. But Mr. Rourke, you should know. Elin's going to ask you herself eventually. She doesn't understand subtle the way I do. When she wants something, she just asks. I'll keep that in mind. Caleb stood, his knees protesting. You should get some sleep. Tomorrow I need to check my trap lines, and I thought maybe you'd want to come along, learn the mountain a bit. Really? Interest sparked in Mara's eyes. You'd teach me? If you're going to live up here, you need to know the land, how to read weather, find your way if you get turned around, spot danger before it spots you. He paused. That is, if you want to learn. I do. Mara carefully returned the locket to the basket, handling it like the precious thing it was. Mr. Rourke, thank you for everything, for not making us feel like we're a burden. You're not a burden, Mara. You're just here, and that's enough. She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and headed back to bed. Caleb stayed at the table, the moonlight slowly shifting across the floor, and wondered what the hell he was doing. Taking in 2 children, teaching them the mountain, letting them carve out space in a life he'd spent 2 decades keeping empty. It was madness. It was dangerous. It was the opposite of every choice he'd made since burying his family. It was also the first thing that had felt right in 20 years. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of winter day that made the mountains look like something from a painting. Caleb woke early, as always, but instead of silence, he heard soft voices from below. The girls were already up, trying to be quiet and failing adorably. You're supposed to add water first, then the cornmeal, Mara was saying. But it's all clumpy, Elin protested. That's because you did it backwards. Caleb descended to find them attempting to make breakfast, the table dusted with cornmeal and the pot on the stove producing questionable smells. Both girls froze when they saw him, guilt written across their faces. We wanted to surprise you, Mara said quickly, but we might have made a mess instead. Caleb surveyed the damage. Not as bad as it could have been, actually. Mush is tricky, takes practice. Will you show us? Elin asked. Her voice was still weak, but stronger than it had been. The color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes held light instead of fever. After breakfast, which means first we need to fix this. He moved to the stove, assessing the situation. Elin, get me the wooden spoon from that hook. Mara, clean water from the barrel outside. We'll salvage this yet. They worked together, the girls following his instructions with serious concentration. Within 20 minutes, they had something resembling edible mush, which they ate with honey and the dried berries Caleb had put up last summer. It's good, Elin announced, though her expression suggested she was being generous. It's adequate, Caleb corrected, but adequate's better than going hungry, so we'll call it success. Will you really take us on the trap line today? Mara asked. Both of us? Caleb looked at Elin, noting how she still tired easily, how her breathing occasionally hitched. Elin, you up for a walk? It'll be cold and we'll be out most of the day. I can do it, Elin said immediately. I'm much better, see? She stood and walked in a small circle, only wobbling slightly. I'm strong again. You're recovering, Caleb corrected gently. There's a difference. But if you promise to speak up when you need rest, you can come. Elin's face lit up like sunrise. I promise. An hour later, they set out into the crystalline morning, Caleb leading and the girls following in his tracks through the snow. He'd given them warmer coats from his supplies, men's coats cut down to fit, but serviceable. They looked like small versions of mountain men themselves, wrapped in wool and fur. Caleb set an easy pace, stopping frequently to point out things he'd learned to read in 2 decades of mountain living. How to tell fresh tracks from old by the sharpness of their edges. Which trees made the best shelter in storms. Where to find water even when everything looked frozen solid. Mara absorbed it all like a desert taking rain, asking questions that showed she understood the deeper principles behind his explanations. Elin paid attention too, though she was more interested in the animals they saw. A red fox watching from a distance, ravens arguing in the pines, the delicate tracks of mice writing stories across the snow. At the first trap, Caleb found a marten, its pelt thick and valuable. He reset the trap with practiced efficiency, then looked at Mara. You want to try the next one? Her eyes widened. Really? Really? But you do exactly as I say. Traps don't care who they catch. They'll take a finger as quick as a marten if you're careless. He showed her the mechanism, explained the safety steps, then watched as she carefully approached the next trap. Her movements were cautious but confident, her small hands doing exactly what he'd demonstrated. When she successfully reset the empty trap, pride flashed across her face. Good work, Caleb said, meaning it. Natural instinct for mechanics. That'll serve you well up here. They continued their circuit, checking the dozen traps Caleb had set before the storm. Most were empty, but they found 2 more marten and a beaver in the water sets near the creek. By the time they turned homeward, the sun had passed its peak and Elin was flagging despite her brave front. Tired? Caleb asked. A little, Elin admitted. Without a word, Caleb crouched down. Climb on. We'll make better time if you're not walking. Elin hesitated only a moment before clambering onto his back, her thin arms wrapping around his neck. She weighed almost nothing, all bones and sharp angles, but Caleb felt the trust in how she relaxed against him, letting him carry her weight without fear. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, Mara ranging ahead to examine things that caught her interest. Then Elin spoke quietly, her voice right by Caleb's ear. Mr. Rourke, can I ask you something? Sure. Are you going to keep us forever, or just until someone better comes along? The question drove straight into Caleb's chest. He adjusted his grip on her legs, buying time to formulate an answer that was both truthful and reassuring. I made a promise to your mother, he said finally. I don't break promises, ever. But what if keeping us is too hard? What if we're too much trouble? Elin, look around, see where we are? She lifted her head, scanning the mountain landscape that surrounded them. In the middle of nowhere? In the middle of somewhere that's become home. These mountains are hard. Every winter tries to kill you, every summer has its own dangers, and you're always one mistake from disaster. He felt her attention sharpen. But hard doesn't mean wrong. Hard just means you have to work for it, pay attention, show up every day ready to do what needs doing. Like keeping us? Like building a family. Because that's what this is, whether we use the word or not. You, Mara, me, we're becoming something together. And yeah, it's hard sometimes, but most worthwhile things are. Elin was quiet, processing this. Then she said something that made Caleb's eyes burn. Mama told us, before she got too sick to talk much, that she was sending us to someone who would love us even though he didn't know it yet. I think she meant you. Your mother was an optimist. She was right about things. She was right about you. Caleb didn't trust himself to respond to that, so he just kept walking, this small girl on his back and her sister ahead of them, and tried to understand how his life had transformed so completely in the space of 2 weeks. They reached the cabin as dusk painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. Smoke rose from the chimney. Caleb had banked the fire before they left, and lamplight glowed in the windows. It looked like something from a storybook, this small haven carved from wilderness. It looked like home. Inside, they peeled off layers and set about preparing dinner, venison stew from the deer Caleb had taken before the storm, with root vegetables he'd stored in the underground cache. The girls helped with increasing competence. Mara chopping vegetables while Elin set the table with careful precision. They ate together as the darkness pressed against the windows, talking about small things, the fox they'd seen, the raven that had scolded them from a tree, how the snow looked different in afternoon light. Normal conversation, the kind Caleb hadn't experienced in so long he'd forgotten how it felt. After dinner, he pulled out one of the books he'd bought, a collection of folk tales and legends. "Either of you know how to read?" "Mama taught us," Mara said. "But we're not very good yet." "Then we'll practice. Reading's important, especially up here where winters are long and entertainment's scarce." He settled into his chair, the girls arranging themselves on the floor nearby. "Who wants to start?" Mara took the book, opening it carefully. Her reading was halting but determined, stumbling over unfamiliar words but refusing to give up. When she got stuck, Caleb helped. When she succeeded, Elin applauded. They were midway through a story about a clever fox when someone knocked on the door. The sound froze them all. Caleb never got visitors at the cabin. Its isolation was precisely the point. He stood slowly, his hand automatically moving toward the rifle above the door. "Get in the loft," he said quietly. "Both of you. Don't come down until I say." "But," Mara started, "now." Something in his tone convinced them. The girls scrambled up the ladder, disappearing into the shadows above. Caleb waited until he heard them settle, then took down the rifle and moved to the door. He opened it to find Pete Garson on his porch, the old trapper's face grim in the lamplight spilling from inside. "Pete, it's late for visiting." "Ain't here for social calls, Rourke." Pete's eyes flicked past Caleb, trying to see into the cabin. "You heard the news from town?" "I don't hear much of anything up here. That's the point." "Well, you need to hear this. Territorial Marshal came through 3 days ago, asking questions about the Ross girls. Someone told him you'd taken them in after their mother died." Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle. "And?" "And he's not happy about it. Says you got no legal right to keep them, that they should be in official custody pending placement." Pete lowered his voice. "He's coming up here tomorrow, Rourke, bringing a deputy and paperwork. Plans to take those girls with him when he leaves." The words landed like physical blows. Caleb had known this was coming, had met with the lawyer, started the guardianship process, but he'd hoped for more time before the system caught up. "I've got a lawyer working on legal guardianship," Caleb said. "That's good, but it might not be good enough. Marshall's got authority to remove children from situations he deems inappropriate. And a single man living alone in the mountains with 2 girls he's got no relation to?" Pete shook his head. "He's going to deem that inappropriate. Those girls just lost their mother. They're finally starting to feel safe, to heal. Taking them now, I know, Rourke, I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's what's going to happen unless you figure out a way to stop it." Pete glanced back over his shoulder, checking the darkness. "I came up here soon as I heard. Figured you deserved warning. What you do with it is your business." "Why help me? Last time we talked, you told me I couldn't save everyone." "Still true. But I've been watching you these past few weeks, seen you turn into something like a father to those girls. They need you, and you need them, whether you'll admit it or not." Pete's weathered face softened slightly. "Besides, I remember your little girl, Emma. You used to bring her to town sometimes before everything went to hell. She had your eyes and her mother's laugh." Caleb hadn't known Pete remembered, hadn't realized anyone from those days had ended up this far west. That was a lifetime ago. Was. But maybe this is your chance to have that life again. Different, but the same in ways that matter. Pete turned to leave. "Marshall will be here by noon tomorrow, weather permitting. You got until then to decide what kind of man you want to be. One who follows rules even when they're wrong, or one who fights for what's his." He disappeared into the darkness before Caleb could respond. Caleb stood in the doorway, cold air pouring in, his mind racing through options that all seemed impossible. He could meet the marshal, try to reason with him, appeal to whatever humanity existed beneath official protocol. Likely outcome: failure and the girls taken anyway. He could fight, refuse to hand them over, let the law see him as an obstacle to be overcome. Likely outcome: arrest and the girls still taken, only now without anyone to advocate for them. He could run, take the girls deeper into the mountains where marshals didn't venture, Buy time until his legal petition went through. Likely outcome: charges of kidnapping, destruction of any chance at legal guardianship, life as a fugitive. Mr. Rourke? Mara's voice came from the loft. Is everything okay? Caleb closed the door, set the rifle back in its place. Come down, both of you. They descended the ladder with the caution of children who'd learned that adult conversations often brought bad news. Caleb gestured them to the table, then sat across from them, trying to figure out how to explain a system that would tear apart what they'd started building. That was Pete Garson, a neighbor. He came to warn me about something. Caleb chose his words carefully. The territorial marshal, that's like a lawman, he heard about you two being here. He thinks you should be in official custody in the territorial system until guardianship gets sorted out. He wants to take us away, Mara said flatly. It wasn't a question. Yes, he's coming here tomorrow. We won't go. Ilin's voice was small, but fierce. We'll hide. We'll run away. No. Caleb held up a hand, stopping her. Running doesn't solve this. It just makes everything worse in the long run. Then what do we do? Mara asked. Her hands gripped the table edge, knuckles white. Just let him take us? Get separated and sent to different places and never see each other again? That's not going to happen. You can't promise that. You don't control what they do with us. No, but I can fight for you, the right way, through the law. Even as he said it, Caleb heard how inadequate it sounded. The law was slow and impersonal and didn't care about newly formed bonds or deathbed promises. The law didn't care when Mama was dying, Mara said bitterly. Didn't care when we were begging for food at that gate. Didn't care until someone decided we were a problem that needed managing. She wasn't wrong. Caleb had seen enough to know that systems designed to help often hurt instead, that rules applied without wisdom could be more destructive than chaos. Listen to me, both of you. I made a promise to your mother, and I meant it. I will fight for you. I will do whatever it takes to keep you safe and together. He leaned forward, meeting their frightened eyes. But I need you to trust me. Trust that I'll find a way through this that doesn't involve running or hiding or making things worse. How? Elin whispered. How can you stop them? I don't know yet, but I've got until tomorrow to figure it out. Caleb stood, pacing to the window. Outside, the night was black and star-filled, the mountains invisible shadows against the sky. In the meantime, I need you to promise me something. What? Mara asked warily. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the marshal says, you stay calm. You don't fight, don't argue, don't make this harder than it already is. You let me handle it. And if you can't, if he takes us anyway, then I will come get you. I will not stop until you're back here, safe. That's my promise. Caleb turned from the window. But I need you to believe in me. Need you to have faith that I won't let you down. The girls looked at each other, some wordless communication passing between them. Finally, Mara nodded. Okay, we'll trust you. Thank you. Caleb felt the weight of that trust settle over him like a physical thing. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be difficult. But sleep didn't come easily that night for any of them. Caleb lay in the loft, staring at the ceiling beams and trying to formulate a plan. The girls whispered to each other below, their voices carrying fragments of fear and forced optimism. Somewhere near dawn, Caleb finally understood what he had to do. It was risky, possibly foolish, and would require perfect timing, but it was the only option that gave them a real chance. He just hoped he was still capable of pulling it off. When morning came, Caleb prepared with the methodical focus of a man about to enter battle. He dressed carefully in his best clothes, still rough by town standards, but clean and respectable. He made the girls do the same, helped them with their hair, made sure they looked cared for and healthy. "What are you planning?" Mara asked as he checked the girls' appearance with critical eyes. "Insurance. The marshal's going to make judgments based on what he sees. I want him to see 2 well-fed, well-dressed, healthy children in a clean home with a man who knows how to care for them. Will that be enough? By itself? No. But combined with what else I've got planned, it might tip the scale our direction." Mara studied him thoughtfully. "You're going to fight him, not with fists, but with words and strategy." "Something like that." "Good." Mara straightened her new dress with unconscious pride. "Because we're worth fighting for. Yes, Caleb said quietly. You are. The marshal arrived just before noon, riding a sturdy bay with a deputy on a chestnut beside him. Caleb watched them approach from the cabin window, noting details with a trapper's eye for reading danger. The marshal was younger than expected, maybe 40, with the rigid posture of someone who relied on authority to compensate for uncertainty. The deputy was older, harder, his hand resting casually near his sidearm. Stay inside until I call you, Caleb told the girls. Then he stepped onto the porch to meet the law. The marshal dismounted, his eyes sweeping the cabin and surroundings with professional assessment. You Caleb Rourke? I am. Marshal James Bennett, Territorial Service. This is Deputy Carver. Bennett pulled papers from his coat. We're here regarding 2 minor children, Mara and Elin Ross, who we have reason to believe are in your custody. They're here, Caleb confirmed. I'm caring for them temporarily. Temporarily? Bennett's tone sharpened. Mr. Rourke, these girls' mother died 2 weeks ago. You've had them here, isolated from proper supervision with no legal authority. That's not temporary, that's kidnapping. Their mother asked me to look after them before she passed. I gave my word. Your word doesn't supersede territorial law. Orphan children are wards of the territory until proper guardianship is established through legal channels. I've petitioned for guardianship. Lawyer in town named Brennan is handling the paperwork. Bennett's expression suggested this was news to him. When? Filed 6 days ago. Emergency temporary guardianship based on medical need. One of the girls was recovering from pneumonia and required ongoing care. Which girl? Elin, the younger twin by 3 minutes. And her condition now? Improving, but she still needs supervision and medicine. Caleb kept his voice even, reasonable. Marshal, I understand you have a job to do, but these girls have been through hell. They just buried their mother. They're finally starting to feel safe, and ripping them away from the only stability they've got right now seems cruel for the sake of procedure. The procedure exists to protect children from situations exactly like this. Bennett gestured at the cabin, the surrounding isolation. A single man living alone in the mountains, taking in 2 young girls he's got no relation to? You see how that looks? I see how it is. 2 children who needed help getting it from someone willing to give it. That's admirable sentiment, Mr. Rourke, but it doesn't change the law. Bennett folded his arms. I'm going to need to see the girls, assess their condition, and make a determination about whether they're being properly cared for. It was the opening Caleb had been waiting for. Of course, they're inside. He turned toward the door, then paused. But Marshal, before you make any determinations, you should know these girls have voices. They get a say in what happens to them. And if you take them from here against their will, they'll fight you every step of the way. Children don't get to choose their guardians, Mr. Rourke. Maybe not legally, but morally? Ethically? Seems like the people most affected by a decision ought to have some input. Caleb opened the door and called the girls. They emerged with dignity that made him proud. Heads up, shoulders straight, faces composed despite the fear he knew they felt. They dressed in their new clothes, their hair was neatly braided, and they looked every inch like children who were being properly cared for. Bennett studied them with professional neutrality, but Caleb saw the moment's surprise flickered across his face. Whatever the marshal had expected to find, neglected, frightened, dirty children, these weren't it. Girls, I'm Marshal Bennett. I'm here to ask you some questions about your living situation. Is that all right? Mara and Elin nodded in unison. How long have you been staying with Mr. Rourke? 2 weeks, Mara answered. Since the storm, right after Mama died. And has he treated you well? Fed you, kept you warm, taken care of you? Yes, sir. He saved Elin's life when she was sick with pneumonia. Sat up with her for 3 days straight, gave her medicine, made sure she didn't die. Mara's voice was steady, factual. He bought us new clothes, books, taught us about the mountain. He's been good to us. Bennett's expression remained neutral, but Caleb saw him making mental notes. And if I were to take you to town, place you in proper care. We don't want proper care, Elin interrupted, her voice quiet but clear. We want to stay here, with Mr. Rourke. He promised our mama he'd keep us together, and he's keeping that promise. Sometimes what we want and what's best for us are different things. Are they? Mara challenged. What's better, staying here with someone who cares whether we live or die, or getting sent to some orphanage where we'll be separated and nobody will remember our names in a year. The territorial system. The territorial system didn't care about us when we were begging for food, didn't care when Mama was dying, didn't care until someone decided we were a problem needing management. Mara's composure cracked slightly, passion breaking through. Mr. Rourke cared. He's the only one who cared. And you want to take us from him because of some rule written by people who've never been cold or hungry or alone? The speech landed in the clearing silence like stones in still water. Bennett's jaw tightened, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Beside him, Deputy Carver shifted uncomfortably. "Marshal," Caleb said quietly, "you came here expecting to find something wrong, expected to find children in danger, a man taking advantage, a situation that needed correcting, but that's not what you're seeing, is it?" Bennett didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved from the girls to the cabin to Caleb, weighing evidence against expectation. "What I see," he said finally, "is a complicated situation that needs proper legal resolution. Which means I need to consult with this lawyer, Brennan, you said, and verify your claims about the guardianship petition. I'll ride to town with you right now. We can visit Brennan together, review the paperwork, confirm everything I've told you. And the girls? They stay here, where they're safe and warm and not being traumatized by bureaucratic uncertainty." Bennett considered this. "If I find out you've been lying, then you can come back with a warrant and arrest me. But I'm not lying, Marshal. I'm just a man trying to keep a promise to a dying woman. That's all this ever was." The marshal and his deputy exchanged a long look. Some wordless communication passed between them. Finally, Bennett nodded. "All right, we'll ride to town, verify your story. But Mr. Rourke, if anything about this situation isn't exactly as you've represented, I will come back with more than just a warrant. Understood?" "Understood." An hour later, Caleb and Marshal Bennett stood in Thomas Brennan's office above the general store, the lawyer spreading documents across his desk with professional flourish. "As you can see, Marshal, Mr. Rourke filed for emergency temporary guardianship 6 days ago, citing immediate medical need. Judge Morrison reviewed the petition and granted temporary status pending full hearing." Brennan tapped one of the papers. "This gives Mr. Rourke legal authority to care for the girls until the permanent guardianship petition is resolved." Bennett studied the document, his expression unreadable. "Why wasn't I notified?" "The filing was quite recent, and with the storm, notification processes were delayed. But I assure you, everything is proper and legal. And the permanent petition will be heard in 4 weeks. Mr. Rourke will need to demonstrate means to provide for the children, undergo character review, and prove the arrangement is in their best interest. But given the circumstances, children with no other family, dying mothers' expressed wishes, evidence of proper care, I expect the judge will rule favorably." Bennett set down the papers, his official demeanor softening slightly. "Mr. Rourke, I owe you an apology. When I heard about 2 girls being kept by a mountain man nobody knew anything about, I assumed the worst. Most people do. I'm used to it." "That doesn't make it right." Bennett extended his hand. "You're doing a good thing here. Those girls need someone, and it looks like you're that someone." Caleb shook the offered hand, relief washing through him so strong it made him dizzy. "Thank you, Marshal." "Don't thank me yet. You've got 4 weeks to prove to a judge that you're fit to raise 2 girls. That means showing you can provide stability, education, proper care. Think you can manage that?" "I'll manage whatever I have to." "I believe you will." Bennett headed for the door, then paused. "One more thing. There's no record of the girl's father, no death certificate, no marriage record for their mother. That might become an issue if he's still alive somewhere and decides to claim them. Their mother said he died before they were born, logging accident in Montana. She said, "But do you have proof?" The question hung unanswered because Caleb didn't have proof, just a dead woman's word and a locket containing a painted face with no name attached. "I'll look into it," Brennan said quickly. "Try to track down marriage and death records, but it may take time." 4 weeks, Bennett reminded them. "That's all you've got before the hearing. Make sure everything is buttoned up tight by then." After the marshal left, Caleb sagged into a chair, exhaustion catching up with adrenaline. Brennan poured 2 glasses of whiskey and slid one across the desk. "That was closer than I'd like," the lawyer said. "But we made it. For now." Bennett's right, though. We need to find documentation about the girl's father. If he's alive and shows up claiming parental rights, your guardianship petition becomes meaningless. He's dead. Catherine wouldn't have lied about that. Probably not. But probably isn't good enough for court. Brennan pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. "I'll write to the Territorial Records Office in Montana, see what I can dig up. In the meantime, you focus on those girls. Make sure when the judge visits, and he will visit before the hearing, he sees exactly what the marshal saw today." Caleb nodded, drained his whiskey, and headed home. The ride back felt different than the ride in. Lighter somehow, despite the weight of challenges still ahead. Because they'd bought time, won the first battle, proven that sometimes fighting for what mattered actually worked. The girls were watching from the window when he arrived, their faces pressed against the glass. They burst out the door before he'd fully dismounted, questions tumbling over each other. "What happened? Did he believe you? Are we safe?" Caleb gathered them both close, awkward but sincere, and felt their small arms wrap around him with desperate relief. "You're safe," he told them. "For now, for always. I promised, didn't I?" And in that moment, with 2 orphaned girls clinging to him like he was the only solid thing in a shifting world, Caleb Rourke understood something he'd been running from for 20 years. Family wasn't about blood or law or even choice, really. It was about showing up, about staying, about fighting for each other when the world said, "Walk away." And for the first time since he'd buried his wife and daughter in Pennsylvania soil, Caleb thought maybe he could do this. Maybe he could be someone's father again. Maybe was a dangerous word Caleb discovered in the weeks that followed. Maybe suggested possibility without promising certainty, hope without guaranteeing outcome. But it was the word that kept him moving forward as winter deepened and the hearing date approached like a storm on the horizon. The days fell into patterns that surprised him with their ordinariness. Wake at dawn, build up the fire, make breakfast with 2 small helpers who were learning to crack eggs without getting shell everywhere. Check the trap lines with Mara, while Elin stayed home doing lessons from the books they'd bought. Afternoons spent teaching them to read better, to cipher numbers, to understand the practical mathematics of measuring flour and calculating distances. Evenings were for stories, for the slow work of becoming something like a family. But underneath the routine ran a current of anxiety that never quite disappeared. 4 weeks to prove to a judge that a mountain hermit could raise 2 girls properly. 4 weeks to transform a cabin built for solitude into a home that met territorial standards for child rearing. 4 weeks to become someone he'd stopped being 20 years ago. 2 weeks into their reprieve, a letter arrived from Brennan. Pete Garson brought it up, his face grim in the afternoon light. "Lawyer said it was urgent," Pete said, handing over the envelope. "Didn't want to trust it to regular post." Caleb opened it standing on the porch, his gut tightening as he read. The girls were inside making bread. He could hear them arguing about whether the dough was kneaded enough, and he was grateful they couldn't see his face as Brennan's words sank in. "Bad news?" Pete asked. "Complicated news." Caleb refolded the letter, his mind already working through implications. "Montana Records Office has no death certificate for a James Ross matching the time frame. No logging accident reported that fits." Meaning the father might be alive? Meaning Catherine might have lied. Or the records are incomplete. Or he used a different name. Caleb shoved the letter in his pocket. Either way, it's a problem. If he's alive and shows up claiming parental rights, everything we're building here collapses. Pete was quiet for a moment, studying the mountains with eyes that had seen too much of human nature. "You think she ran from him? Took the girls and disappeared?" "I think a woman doesn't travel alone across territories with twin daughters unless she's running from something or toward something desperate." Caleb's voice hardened. "Question is whether what she ran from is going to come looking. And if it does, then I deal with it, same as everything else." Pete nodded, accepting this without argument. "Girls know?" "Not yet. No point worrying them until we know more." "Fair enough." Pete turned to leave, then paused. "Rourke? You're doing good here. Don't let some piece of paper tell you different." After Pete left, Caleb stood on the porch watching the sun sink toward the peaks. Inside, the girls laughed at something, a sound that had become familiar over the past weeks, that he'd unconsciously started listening for. The sound of children who felt safe enough to be children. He couldn't lose that. Couldn't let some ghost from Catherine's past destroy what they'd built. But he also couldn't ignore the possibility that the man in that locket might come claiming what the law said was his. Dinner that night was quieter than usual. The girls noticed Caleb's distraction, but had learned when to push and when to let silence stand. They ate the bread they'd made, slightly overdone but edible, and cleaned up afterward with the efficiency that came from established routine. "Mr. Rourke?" Mara said as they finished. "Can I ask you something?" "Always. Are we in trouble?" "You've been worried since Pete came." Caleb should have known she'd notice. Mara missed nothing, saw patterns before they fully formed. "Not trouble exactly, just complications with the legal process." "What kind of complications?" He considered lying, offering some easier version of the truth. But these girls had earned honesty, had proven they could handle hard truths better than comfortable fictions. "The lawyer can't find death records for your father, which means there's a possibility he's still alive somewhere." Mara's face went carefully blank, the expression she wore when processing information she didn't want to feel. Elin just looked confused. "But Papa died before we were born," Elin said. "Mama told us." "The logging accident." "Your mother told you that, yes. But sometimes people say things that aren't exactly true for reasons that made sense at the time." Caleb kept his voice gentle. "I'm not saying she lied. Just that maybe the situation was more complicated than a simple accident." "You think she was running from him?" Mara said flatly. It wasn't a question. "I think it's possible. A woman doesn't drag two daughters across half the territory for no reason. Either she was running from something bad or toward something better." "Or both," Mara said quietly. She looked at her sister, some silent communication passing between them. "We don't remember anything before Montana. Mama never talked about before. Whenever we asked, she'd change the subject." "Did she ever seem scared, like she was watching for someone?" Mara thought about this, her expression distant with memory. "Sometimes. In towns, mostly. She'd get nervous around men with certain looks, big men, loud men, men who drank too much. And she never let us talk to strangers, never let us tell anyone our full names." The picture forming in Caleb's mind was one he'd seen before. A woman fleeing abuse, trying to protect her children, building a new life from pieces of a shattered one. Catherine Ross might have lied about her husband's death, but if she had, it was likely for good reason. "If he is alive," Elin asked in a small voice, "will he come get us?" "Not if I have anything to say about it." Caleb's voice carried a certainty he wasn't sure he felt. "You're safe here. Whatever happens with lawyers and courts and legal complications, I won't let anyone take you somewhere you don't want to go." "You can't promise that," Mara said. "The law. The law is written by people who don't know you, who can't see what you need, who make decisions based on papers and procedures instead of truth." Caleb leaned forward, catching both girls' eyes. "I learned something 20 years ago when I lost my family. Sometimes following rules gets you nowhere but heartbroken. Sometimes you have to fight for what matters, even when the system says you're wrong." "You'd break the law for us?" Mara's voice held wonder and fear in equal measure. "I'd do whatever necessary to keep you safe. That's what family means." The word hung in the air between them. Family. He'd said it without thinking, without the careful distance he usually maintained. But once spoken, Caleb realized it was true. These girls had become his family somewhere between the first night he'd carried Elin through the storm and this moment, sitting at a rough table in lamplight, discussing futures that might never happen. "Mr. Rourke?" Elin's voice was hesitant. "Can we ask you something else? Something we've been wanting to ask for a while?" "Go ahead." "Can we call you Papa?" The question landed like a physical blow. Caleb had known it was coming. Mara had warned him weeks ago. But he still wasn't prepared for the hope in Elin's eyes, the careful neutrality in Mara's expression that hid desperate wanting. Papa. The word he'd buried with Emma, that he'd thought he'd never hear directed at him again. "You don't have to answer now," Mara said quickly, seeing his struggle. "We know it's complicated. We know we're not really your daughters, not the way Emma was, Stop! Caleb's voice came out rougher than intended. He took a breath, steadied himself. Emma was my daughter by birth. That's a fact that can't be changed or replaced. But family isn't just about blood. It's about choice, about showing up, about the promises we keep to each other. He paused, searching for words adequate to what he felt. You want to call me Papa? I won't stop you. Would be honored, actually. But you should know, if I'm your Papa, that means I'm in this completely. No halfway, no temporary. It means whatever comes, we face it together. We know, Mara said softly. That's why we're asking. Elin slid out of her chair and came around the table, wrapping her arms around Caleb's neck with the unself-conscious affection of a child who'd decided someone was safe. Thank you, Papa, she whispered. The word, spoken in her small voice, cracked something open in Caleb's chest. He pulled her close, then held out an arm for Mara, who came more slowly but no less certainly. He held them both, these two girls who'd lost their mother and found him, and tried to understand how his life had transformed so completely. 20 years of carefully constructed isolation, shattered by 2 children and a dying woman's request. And somehow, impossibly, it felt like coming home. The next morning brought unexpected visitors, Marshall Bennett and a woman Caleb didn't recognize. He saw them riding up the trail while he was splitting wood, the girls inside practicing their letters. Company, he called through the door. Marshall Bennett and someone else. Mara appeared instantly, her face tight with worry. Is he taking us? He's got no grounds to take you. We've got legal guardianship, remember? Caleb set down his axe. But stay inside until I know what this is about. He met them halfway between the cabin and the woodpile. Bennett dismounted with the easy grace of someone comfortable in the saddle, while the woman, middle-aged, stern-faced, carrying a leather satchel, descended more carefully. Mr. Rourke, Bennett said, this is Mrs. Eleanor Walsh. She's with the Territorial Child Welfare Office. Caleb's stomach dropped. Didn't know we had one of those. It's relatively new, Mrs. Walsh said, her voice crisp and professional. Established last year to ensure children in territorial custody receive appropriate care. Marshall Bennett informed me of your situation with the Ross girls. I'm here to conduct an evaluation. An evaluation? Standard procedure for temporary guardianship cases involving unrelated minors. I'll need to inspect your home, interview the children, and assess whether the living situation meets territorial standards for child welfare. She pulled papers from her satchel. I have authorization from Judge Morrison. Caleb glanced at Bennett, who gave a small apologetic shrug. So this was how it was going to be. Not an outright removal, but death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. If Mrs. Walsh decided the cabin wasn't suitable, if she found any reason to question his fitness as a guardian, the temporary status could be revoked instantly. Fine, Caleb said, because he had no choice. Inspect whatever you need to. Mrs. Walsh spent 2 hours examining every aspect of their life with the thoroughness of someone looking for problems. She measured the cabin's square footage, noted the sleeping arrangements, checked food stores, examined the girls' clothing. She questioned them about their daily routine, their education, their health. She asked Caleb about his income, his background, his plans for their future. Through it all, Caleb maintained careful control, answering honestly but strategically. Yes, the cabin was small, but it was well built and weather-tight. Yes, he had limited income, but trapping provided enough to meet their needs. Yes, he'd lived alone for 20 years, but he'd raised a daughter before and knew what children required. The girls were perfect, polite, articulate, clearly well cared for. Mara answered questions with the careful precision of someone who understood the stakes. Elin's natural sweetness won over even Mrs. Walsh's professional skepticism. But as the evaluation dragged on, Caleb felt the weight of judgment settling over everything they'd built. Every meal, every lesson, every small moment of their life together reduced to checkboxes on a form. Finally, Mrs. Walsh closed her notepad and fixed Caleb with an assessing stare. Mr. Rourke, I'll be frank with you. This situation is highly irregular. Single men don't typically raise young girls, especially in isolated circumstances like this. Times are changing, Caleb said evenly. Perhaps. But my job isn't to facilitate social change. It's to ensure children's welfare and safety. She glanced at the girls, who stood close together near the fire. That said, I can't deny that these children appear healthy, happy, and well-adjusted. They clearly care for you, and you for them. So your recommendation? Will be conditional approval pending several requirements. First, you'll need to hire a woman to help with the girls' care, a housekeeper or tutor who can provide appropriate female guidance. Second, you'll need to ensure they're receiving proper education, either by hiring a qualified teacher or enrolling them in school once weather permits. Third, I'll be conducting monthly follow-up visits until the permanent guardianship hearing. Each requirement felt like a chain being wrapped around their life, binding them to standards set by people who'd never spent a winter in these mountains. But Caleb swallowed his objections and nodded. I can arrange that. See that you do. The judge places significant weight on my recommendations, Mr. Rourke. Don't give me reason to change my assessment. Mrs. Walsh packed her satchel with brisk efficiency. I'll file my initial report tomorrow. Expect my next visit in 4 weeks, the day before your hearing. After they left, Caleb sat heavily at the table while the girls hovered nearby, uncertainty written across their faces. What does it mean? Mara asked. The conditional approval? Means we passed, but barely. Means we have to jump through more hoops to prove we're good enough. Caleb rubbed his face, exhaustion catching up. Means I need to find a woman willing to come up here regularly to teach you things I apparently can't. That's stupid, Elin said with rare anger. You teach us plenty. We're learning reading and ciphering and how to survive in the mountains. What else do we need? According to Mrs. Walsh, female guidance, proper education, all the things territorial standards say girls require. Caleb heard the bitterness in his own voice and tried to soften it. She's not wrong, exactly. You do need things I can't give you, but finding someone willing to make the trip up here regularly, someone I trust around you, that won't be easy. What if we can't find anyone? Mara's practical mind was already working through scenarios. Will they take us away? They'll try. Whether they succeed is a different question. Caleb met her eyes. But let's not borrow trouble. We'll figure this out, same as everything else. The solution came from an unexpected source 3 days later. Caleb was in town buying supplies when he ran into Martha Henley outside the general store. She looked thinner than when he'd last seen her, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of troubles he couldn't see. Martha, he said, tipping his hat. You're looking well. You're a terrible liar, Rourke. But she smiled slightly, some of the hardness in her face easing. I heard about your evaluation with Mrs. Walsh. Small territory. Word travels fast. Apparently. Caleb shifted his packages. She wants me to hire a woman to help with the girls, someone to provide proper female guidance, whatever that means. Martha was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. Then she said something that surprised him. I could do it. Come up once a week, teach them what they need to know. Cooking, sewing, the social graces girls are expected to have. Martha, you've got the in. Had the in. Roy drank away the last of our credit. We're losing the place end of the month. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Caleb heard the pain underneath. I need work and you need help. Seems like we could help each other. Caleb studied her, seeing past the hard exterior to the decent woman trapped in circumstances she couldn't control. What about Roy? What about him? He made his choices and I'm making mine. I'm done sacrificing my life for a man who can't stay sober long enough to appreciate it. Martha lifted her chin. Those girls need someone, and I failed them once already. Let me make it right. You didn't fail them. You did what you could in a bad situation. I let them sit outside begging for weeks, let their mother die in my inn while I worried about what Roy would think. That's failure, no matter how you dress it up. Martha's eyes glistened. Give me a chance to do better, please. Caleb thought about the requirements Mrs. Walsh had set, about the conditional approval hanging over their heads like a sword. Martha knew the girls, cared about them, and desperately needed the work. It solved multiple problems at once. Once a week, he said. Wednesdays if the weather holds. I'll pay fair wages and provide supplies. You teach them whatever you think they need to know, and you report honestly about their progress. Relief washed over Martha's face. Thank you. You won't regret this. I better not. Those girls have been through enough. They don't need more disappointment. They won't get it from me. I promise. Martha started the following Wednesday, arriving on a borrowed horse with saddlebags full of teaching materials. The girls were wary at first, Martha represented the inn where their mother had died, the place where they'd spent cold mornings begging. But Martha handled them with patient firmness, showing them respect while maintaining clear boundaries. She taught them to cook beyond basic survival, how to make proper bread, how to prepare meat so it stayed tender, how to preserve vegetables for winter. She taught them to sew, not just mending, but actual garment construction. She taught them the social expectations of proper young women, though she was honest about which rules were foolish and which actually mattered. Most importantly, she listened. When Mara needed to talk about her mother, Martha was there. When Elin had nightmares about the days watching Catherine die, Martha sat with her. She filled a space in their lives that Caleb couldn't, not because he didn't care, but because some lessons required a woman's perspective. The cabin slowly transformed under Martha's influence. She brought curtains to soften the rough interior, taught the girls to arrange wildflowers in jars, showed them how to create beauty in a spare environment. She didn't try to make the place something it wasn't. It remained a mountain cabin, practical and unadorned, but it became warmer somehow, more like a home. "You've done good work here," she told Caleb one Wednesday afternoon while the girls practiced their needlework. "Those children are thriving. They're resilient. They'd probably thrive anywhere. Don't sell yourself short. Resilience only carries you so far. They're thriving because they feel loved and secure. That's you, not them." Martha paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Mrs. Walsh will see that when she comes back. You'll get your permanent guardianship." "You sound certain." "I am certain. Because I've watched you with those girls, and you're exactly what they need. Someone steady and honest who shows up every single day. That's rare, Rourke. Don't underestimate its value." But certainty was a luxury Caleb couldn't afford, not with the hearing looming and too many unknowns still lurking. The question of the girl's father haunted him, made worse by another letter from Brennan 3 weeks after the first. This one contained news that sent ice through Caleb's veins. "Found something," Brennan wrote in his cramped script. "Man named James Carver. Note, the last name matches the deputy who came with Bennett. Was married to Catherine Miller in Helena, Montana, 8 years ago. No divorce on record. No death certificate. Marriage certificate lists Carver as a silver mine foreman. I've sent inquiries to Helena but haven't received responses yet. We'll keep searching." Caleb read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new implications. Catherine had been married to someone named Carver. The deputy who'd accompanied Bennett on that first visit had been named Carver. Coincidence? Or a Deputy Carver recognized something about the girls, made connections Caleb hadn't seen. That night, Caleb rode down to Pete Garson's place, the letter burning in his pocket. He found the old trapper skinning a beaver by lantern light, his hands steady despite his age. "Pete, you know anything about Deputy Carver, the one who came up with Bennett?" Pete didn't look up from his work. "No, he's from Montana originally, worked the silver mines before moving into law enforcement. Hard man but fair from what I hear. Why?" "Because I think he might be the girl's father, or at least related to him." Pete's knife stilled. "That's a hell of a thing to think." Catherine's married name was Carver. She ran from Montana to Wyoming with twin daughters. Never divorced, never explained why. Caleb's voice was tight. "Too many coincidences, Pete. Too many pieces that fit." "You think Carver recognized them when Bennett brought him up?" "I think it's possible. I think maybe he's been watching this whole time, waiting to see what I do." Caleb paced Pete's small cabin, unable to stand still. "Question is, if he is their father, why hasn't he said anything? Why let me go through the guardianship process?" "Maybe he's not sure they're his, or maybe he's testing you, seeing if you'll actually follow through." Pete wiped his blade clean, his expression thoughtful. "Or maybe, and this is the possibility you need to consider, maybe he knows why Catherine ran and doesn't want them back." The words settled into Caleb's gut like stones. "You think he's dangerous?" "I think a woman doesn't flee across territories without good reason. And I think a man who'd give a woman reason to flee might be a man who shouldn't have custody of children." Pete met Caleb's eyes. "But that's speculation. What matters is what you're going to do about it." "What can I do?" "If he's their father, he has legal rights that trump any guardianship petition." "Legal rights based on what? A marriage certificate and timing?" "He'd have to prove paternity, prove he has a claim. That takes time, evidence, court proceedings. Pete's weathered face hardened. Time you can use to make sure those girls are so firmly established in your care that removing them would be seen as harmful, regardless of biology. Caleb rode back through the darkness, Pete's words echoing in his mind. Make them so firmly established that removing them would be harmful. It was a strategy, but it required something Caleb had been avoiding: public acknowledgement of their relationship, integration into community, visible evidence of family bonds. He'd spent 20 years avoiding exactly that kind of exposure. Now he'd need to embrace it to protect the girls. The hearing was in 1 week. Mrs. Walsh returned for her final evaluation 3 days before the hearing, her arrival perfectly timed to cause maximum anxiety. But this time, Caleb was ready. The cabin was spotless. The girls' lessons were prepared and documented, and Martha was there to testify about their progress. Mr. Rourke has exceeded all requirements, Martha told Mrs. Walsh. The girls are receiving comprehensive education in practical and social skills. They're healthy, well-adjusted, and clearly loved. Mrs. Walsh conducted her inspection with the same thorough professionalism, but Caleb noticed something different in her manner: less skepticism, more approval. She still asked hard questions, still pushed for details, but her overall demeanor suggested someone whose mind was already made up. These children have made remarkable progress, she said at the end. Not just academically, but emotionally. They've found stability and security here. That's not something to be disrupted lightly. So your recommendation? Caleb asked, not daring to hope. Will be for permanent guardianship, with the condition that Mrs. Henley's weekly instruction continues and that the girls attend formal school once spring comes and roads are passable. Mrs. Walsh's stern expression softened slightly. You've done well, Mr. Rourke. Against significant odds, you've created a proper home for these children. The judge will see that. After she left, the girls erupted in celebration, hugging each other, hugging Caleb, dancing around the cabin with relief and joy. Even Martha smiled, her usual reserve cracking. But Caleb couldn't fully share their happiness, because he knew something they didn't, that Mrs. Walsh's recommendation might not matter if Deputy Carver decided to step forward and claim paternal rights. The hearing was in 3 days. 3 days to prepare for questions he couldn't answer, challenges he couldn't predict, threats he could only guess at. 3 days until everything they'd built either became permanent or shattered completely. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep, Caleb sat at the table with the locket he'd taken from Martha's basket of Catherine's belongings. He opened it, studying the painted face of the man Catherine had called James. Was this Carver? Was this the man she'd fled? Or was it someone else entirely, a fiction created to explain away an inconvenient truth? Whoever you are, Caleb said quietly to the portrait, you gave up your right to these girls when you let their mother run scared across half the territory. They're mine now, and I don't give up what's mine. The painted face offered no response, just stared back with flat eyes that revealed nothing. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow. Another storm was building, one that might close the passes and delay the hearing. But Caleb had learned that storms couldn't be avoided, only weathered. You faced them with whatever strength you had, protected what mattered, and survived the best way you knew how. He'd survived worse than a courtroom. He'd survived losing everything that mattered once already. This time, he'd fight to keep what he'd found. This time, he wouldn't run. The morning of the hearing arrived with clear skies and bitter cold, the kind of day that made the mountains look beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Caleb dressed carefully in his best clothes, helped the girls into the dresses Martha had made them, and tried to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. Are you scared? Elin asked as they prepared to leave. Terrified, Caleb admitted. But that doesn't mean we won't win. It just means what we're fighting for matters enough to be scared of losing. We won't lose, Mara said with fierce certainty. We can't. We're a family now. Caleb looked at these 2 girls who'd somehow become his daughters, who'd carved out space in a heart he'd thought was permanently closed, and felt the truth of Mara's words settle into his bones. They were a family. Legally or not, biologically or not, they belonged to each other in ways that mattered more than any court could recognize or deny. You're right, he said quietly. We're a family, and families fight for each other. They rode toward town together, 3 people bound by choice and circumstance and love, heading into a battle whose outcome would determine everything. Whatever waited in that courtroom, whether justice or bureaucracy, understanding or judgment, they would face it together. And if the system failed them, if the law proved inadequate to protect what they'd built, then Caleb Rourke would become what he'd always been in these mountains. A man who survived by his own rules, who protected his own by whatever means necessary. He'd made a promise to a dying woman. He'd made a promise to these girls. And he would keep it, no matter what it cost. The courthouse sat at the end of Main Street like a judgment waiting to be delivered. A two-story brick building that represented law and order in a territory that barely understood either concept. Caleb had passed it 100 times over the years without giving it much thought. Now, with the girls flanking him as they climbed the steps, it felt like walking into a cage whose door might not open again. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and wood polish. A clerk directed them to the second-floor courtroom, where Thomas Brennan waited with papers spread across a table. The lawyer looked up as they entered, his young face tight with tension. "Good, you're early. We need to talk before the judge arrives." Brennan gestured them closer, lowering his voice. "I received word this morning. Deputy Carver has filed a motion to intervene in the proceedings." Caleb's blood went cold. On what grounds? He's claiming possible paternal interest. Says he was married to Catherine Miller 8 years ago, that the timeline matches the girls' ages, and that he has a right to determine their custody before any guardianship is finalized. Brennan's expression was grim. The judge is allowing him to present his case. Can he do that? Just show up and claim them? If he can prove paternity and demonstrate he's a fit parent, yes. The rights of biological parents supersede guardianship petitions, even when the mother's dying wishes are documented. Brennan glanced at the girls, who were listening with wide eyes. "I'm sorry, I didn't see this coming." Mara's hand found Caleb's, gripping tight. "He can't take us. We don't even know him." "That might not matter legally," Brennan said gently, "but we'll fight it. We'll argue that disrupting your established care would be harmful, that your mother's clear wishes should be respected, that Carver abandoned his parental responsibilities by not coming forward sooner." "When did she abandon them?" a voice said from the doorway. "When his wife disappeared with his children in the middle of the night without explanation? When she changed their names and fled across territories to avoid being found?" Deputy Carver stood in the entrance, his weathered face impossible to read. He was taller than Caleb remembered, broader through the shoulders, with eyes that held the kind of hardness that came from years of seeing the worst in people. "Mr. Carver," Brennan said carefully, "this is highly irregular. You should be waiting outside until the judge decides whether I get to speak for myself about my own daughters." Carver stepped fully into the room. "I don't think so, Counselor. I've waited 8 years to find them. I can wait another few minutes inside rather than out." Caleb moved instinctively, putting himself between Carver and the girls. "If they were your daughters, you would have found them before now." "Would I? A woman runs in the middle of the night, takes a new name, moves to a different territory, tells everyone her husband is dead. How exactly was I supposed to find her?" Carver's voice held bitterness that sounded genuine. "I searched for 2 years before I gave up. Thought maybe they were all dead. Then I see these 2 girls in a mountain cabin, and they've got Catherine's face, her hair, her way of standing. You telling me I shouldn't want to know if they're mine?" "What we're telling you," Brennan interjected, "is that timing matters. You've known about these girls for weeks and said nothing. Now, the day of the guardianship hearing, you suddenly decide to file a motion? That looks like disruption, not legitimate parental concern. That looks like a man who wanted to see if Rourke would do right by them before I complicated things." Carver's eyes found Mara, who stared back with fierce distrust. "I was there when Bennett first came up to the cabin, remember? Saw how Rourke fought for you, how he'd set things up proper. Part of me wanted to just let it be. Let you have the stability you'd found." "Then why didn't you?" Caleb demanded. "Because they're my daughters. Because their mother took them from me without giving me a chance to be their father. Because no matter how good Rourke's intentions are, blood matters." Carver's voice roughened. "I lost my wife and children in one night. You asking me to just walk away from the only family I've got left?" "We're not your family," Mara said, her voice shaking but defiant. "We don't know you. Mama never mentioned you. If you were worth keeping, she wouldn't have run." The words hit Carver visibly, his expression cracking for just a moment before professional neutrality reasserted itself. Your mother had her reasons for leaving. Whether they were good reasons or not isn't for a 7-year-old to judge. I'm old enough to judge whether I want to go with a stranger. Mara's hand tightened on Caleb's. And I don't. Neither do I, Elin added quietly, moving closer to her sister. Before Carver could respond, the clerk called from the doorway. Judge Morrison is ready. Everyone take your places. The courtroom was smaller than Caleb expected, with wooden benches for spectators and a raised desk for the judge. Marshall Bennett sat in the front row, his presence a reminder that this was about more than just one man's petition. Mrs. Walsh was there too, her severe face giving nothing away. Martha Henley sat near the back, her hands folded in her lap but her eyes fierce with support. Judge Morrison entered through a side door, a man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and a face that suggested he'd heard every excuse and lie the territory could produce. He settled behind his desk, adjusted his spectacles, and surveyed the room with the detachment of someone who'd learned not to prejudge. We're here to consider the petition of Caleb Rourke for permanent guardianship of Mara and Elin Ross, orphan minors currently in his temporary care. The judge's voice carried the formal cadence of legal proceedings. I've reviewed the initial petition, Mrs. Walsh's evaluation reports, and he glanced at papers before him. A motion to intervene filed by Deputy James Carver, claiming possible paternal interest. This is unusual, but will proceed in the interest of determining what's best for the children. He looked at Caleb. Mr. Rourke, you've been caring for these girls for approximately 6 weeks. Tell me why you believe permanent guardianship is appropriate. Caleb stood, his throat tight. He'd practiced what to say, rehearsed arguments with Brennan, but now all the careful words evaporated. What remained was simple truth. Their mother asked me to keep them safe and together. She looked at me with the last clear moment she had and chose me to protect her daughters. I didn't know her well, didn't know the girls at all, but I made a promise. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Since then, I've done my best to honor that promise. Fed them, sheltered them, taught them what I know, hired help when I couldn't provide what they needed, made my cabin into a home instead of just a place to survive. And you believe you're equipped to raise 2 young girls? A man who's lived alone for 20 years? No, sir, I'm not equipped. Never claimed to be. But I'm willing to learn, willing to change, willing to put their needs before my own comfort. That counts for something. Judge Morrison made a note. Mrs. Walsh, your assessment? Mrs. Walsh stood with the rigid posture of someone delivering testimony under oath. Initially, I had significant concerns about this arrangement. Single men don't typically raise young girls, especially in isolated mountain settings. However, my evaluations revealed a situation that exceeded territorial standards. The children are well-nourished, properly clothed, receiving appropriate education, and demonstrating strong emotional attachment to Mr. Rourke. They feel safe with him, which is perhaps the most important factor. And your recommendation? Permanent guardianship with conditions. Continued weekly instruction from Mrs. Henley, formal schooling when weather permits, and periodic follow-up evaluations to ensure standards are maintained. Thank you. The judge turned to Carver. Deputy, you've filed a motion claiming paternal interest. What evidence do you have to support this claim? Carver stood, his uniform lending him an authority that Caleb's rough mountain clothes couldn't match. I was married to Catherine Miller in Helena, Montana, 8 years ago. I have the marriage certificate. The twins were born 7 months after the wedding, premature, the doctor said, though timing was close. Catherine and I had difficulties, arguments about money and my drinking, but nothing that warranted her disappearing with our daughters. You say our daughters, but can you prove paternity? They have my eyes, my mother's chin, my grandfather's auburn hair. But beyond physical resemblance, there's timeline and circumstance. Catherine left Helena exactly 8 years ago with 2 infant girls. These girls are 7, which means they were born around that time. Too many details match to be coincidence. Physical resemblance isn't proof, Brennan objected. Timing isn't proof. Deputy Carver is asking this court to disrupt an established guardianship based on speculation and circumstantial evidence. It's more than speculation, Carver shot back. Why would Catherine run if she wasn't fleeing something? Why disappear completely unless she was hiding from someone specific? Perhaps she was hiding from you, Brennan said coldly. Perhaps she had good reason to take her children and run from a man who admits to drinking and fighting. Perhaps her dying wish that Mr. Rourke raise her daughters was specifically meant to keep them away from their biological father. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Order, Mr. Brennan, that's inflammatory speculation without evidence. Then let's talk about evidence, Brennan pressed. Deputy Carver claims these are his daughters, but took no action when Marshal Bennett first informed him of their existence weeks ago. He watched from a distance while Mr. Rourke cared for them, waited until the guardianship hearing to suddenly assert parental rights. That's not the behavior of a concerned father. It's the behavior of someone looking for leverage or revenge. Or the behavior of a man who wanted to see if they'd be properly cared for before disrupting their lives, Carver countered. I've spent 8 years not knowing if my family was alive or dead. Excuse me for taking time to assess the situation before tearing them away from stability. Judge Morrison held up a hand, silencing both men. I want to hear from the children themselves. Young ladies, please stand. Mara and Elin rose together, holding hands. They looked impossibly small standing before the judge's bench, two thin girls in homemade dresses who'd already lived through more than most children should experience. Mara, you're the elder twin, correct? Yes, sir, by 3 minutes. Do you remember anything about your life before living with your mother in Wyoming? Mara thought carefully before answering. No, sir. Mama never talked about before. When we asked, she'd say the past didn't matter, only what came next. And do you remember your mother ever mentioning your father? She said he died before we were born. Logging accident. That's all she ever told us. Looking at Deputy Carver now, do you recognize him? Does he seem familiar in any way? Mara studied Carver with the serious attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. No, sir. I've never seen him before the day he came up with Marshal Bennett, and even then, he was just a deputy, not anyone special. Judge Morrison turned to Carver. Do you have any physical evidence linking you to these children? Letters, photographs, anything beyond your marriage certificate and timeline? No. Catherine took everything when she left. Our marriage license is all I have to prove we were connected at all. Then we have a difficult situation. You claim paternity based on circumstantial evidence. Mr. Rourke has guardianship based on the mother's dying request and 6 weeks of demonstrated care. Both have merit, neither has certainty. The judge removed his spectacles, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Normally, I'd order a delay while we investigate further, attempt to verify or disprove Deputy Carver's claims through available records and witnesses. But that delays resolution for these children, who've already experienced significant disruption. Your Honor, Martha Henley called from the back of the room. May I speak? Judge Morrison looked surprised, but nodded. Mrs. Henley, you were present when Catherine Ross died, correct? I was. She stayed at my inn while ill, and I cared for her as best I could. Martha stood, her voice steady despite obvious nervousness. She talked to me, Your Honor. In those final weeks when the fever would break and she'd have clear moments, she talked about why she ran. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Even the judge leaned forward, attention sharpening. What did she tell you? She said her husband was a good man when sober, but a dangerous one when drunk. Said he never hit her, but his temper scared her, made her worry what he might do to the girls as they got older. She said she tried to make it work, but after he came home drunk one night and nearly dropped one of the babies, she knew she had to leave. So she took what money she'd saved, packed what she could carry, and disappeared while he was working a night shift at the mines. Martha's eyes found Carver. She said she felt guilty for not giving him a chance to change, for not trying harder to fix things. But she said her daughter's safety mattered more than fairness, that sometimes running was the only way to keep people safe. Carver's face had gone pale, his jaw working as he processed Martha's testimony. She never gave me a chance, he said hoarsely. One mistake, one night, when I'd had too much and was clumsy, and she condemned me for it forever. Was it one night? Judge Morrison asked quietly. Or was it a pattern Mrs. Ross recognized before it became something worse? I was trying to stop drinking. I'd cut back, was working on it. While working night shifts at a silver mine and raising infant twins. Mr. Carver, I've seen this story too many times. Good men who mean well but can't control their drinking. Wives who stay too long hoping things will change. Children who pay the price for their parents' problems. The judge's voice hardened. Mrs. Ross made a choice to protect her daughters. She may have denied you the chance to prove you'd changed, but she had that right. So that's it? Carver's voice broke. 8 years of searching, and I don't even get to know them? Don't get to explain, to apologize, to try to be their father now that I'm sober. How long have you been sober? Brennan asked. 5 years. Completely dry. I got help after Catherine left, realized what I'd lost, turned my life around. Carver looked at the girls, his expression naked with grief. I'm not the man I was. I'm better now. Doesn't that count for something? Judge Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face reflecting the weight of decisions that had no perfect answer. It counts for something, Deputy. It speaks to character and effort, but it doesn't override the established bond these children have formed with Mr. Rourke, or their mother's clear wishes, or the reality that you're a stranger to them regardless of biology. Then what are you saying? I'm saying the law isn't just about blood rights. It's about children's welfare, about stability and safety, and what serves their best interests. The judge looked at Mara and Elin. Young ladies, I have a question for you, and I need you to answer honestly. If I granted Deputy Carver's petition, if I said you had to go live with him because he might be your biological father, what would you do? Mara didn't hesitate. We'd run. Soon as we could, we'd take Elin and disappear into the mountains. We'd live rough before we'd go with a stranger. Even knowing he might truly be your father? Especially knowing that. Because if he is our father, then Mama ran from him for good reason. And if Mama, who loved us more than anything, chose Mr. Rourke to protect us instead of going back to our father, that tells me everything I need to know. The logic was irrefutable, delivered with a 7-year-old's clarity. Judge Morrison smiled slightly, sadly, then turned to Caleb. Mr. Rourke, if I grant permanent guardianship, would you be willing to allow supervised visits between Deputy Carver and the girls? Give them a chance to know him, decide for themselves whether they want a relationship? Caleb looked at the girls, reading their body language, their fear, their desperate hope that he'd protect them from this threat. Then he looked at Carver and saw something he recognized, a man haunted by loss, trying to reclaim what had been taken, fighting against a system that seemed determined to keep him from his children. He thought about his own daughter, about how he'd give anything for one more day with Emma, about how the years of isolation hadn't healed that wound, just buried it. If the girls agree, Caleb said slowly, I won't prevent contact. But it's their choice, not mine or yours, or even the court's. They decide if and when they're ready to know him. Carver's expression twisted. That's not enough. That's leaving the decision to children too young to understand. They understand plenty, Caleb interrupted. They understand their mother ran scared. They understand you showing up now, after all this time, feels like a threat instead of a rescue. They understand that blood doesn't automatically mean family. His voice softened. Maybe if you'd come forward when Bennett first found them, if you'd approached this differently, they'd feel otherwise. But you waited, watched, calculated. That's not what fathers do. I was trying to do right by them. No, you were trying to do right by yourself, by your own grief and guilt. There's a difference. The words landed hard, and Carver seemed to deflate, his official bearing crumbling to reveal the broken man beneath. I just wanted a chance, he whispered, one chance to be their father. Then earn it, Judge Morrison said firmly. Not through legal claims, but through patience and respect, and letting these girls come to you in their own time, if they ever do. He looked around the courtroom, his gaze settling on each person involved. I'm ruling in favor of Mr. Rourke's petition for permanent guardianship. The bond between guardian and children is established, the mother's wishes are clear, and disrupting that arrangement would cause more harm than good. Relief crashed through Caleb so hard he had to grab the table for support. Beside him, the girls clung to each other, tears streaming down their faces. However, the judge continued, I'm not dismissing Deputy Carver's claims entirely. If he wishes to pursue a relationship with these children, he may do so through Mr. Rourke and with the girls' consent. If paternity is ever definitively proven, we can revisit custody arrangements at that time, but for now, stability takes precedence over biology. He brought his gavel down with finality. Guardianship is granted. This hearing is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and movement. Martha was crying openly in the back row. Mrs. Walsh nodded with professional satisfaction. Marshal Bennett caught Caleb's eye and offered a small, approving nod. Carver stood frozen, staring at the girls with an expression that held grief and acceptance in equal measure. Finally, he moved toward them, stopping a respectful distance away. "I won't push," he said quietly. "Won't force anything you're not ready for. But if someday you want to know about your mother when she was young, or what she was like before things went wrong, or just want to understand where you came from, I'll be here. That's all I can offer." Mara looked at him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she did something Caleb didn't expect. She stepped forward and held out her hand. "Thank you for trying to do better," she said. "Mama would have liked knowing that. Maybe someday we can talk about her, about who she was before. But not today. Today, we just want to go home." Carver took her hand gently, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you. That's more grace than I deserve." He left then, walking out of the courtroom with the heavy step of a man who'd lost something precious, but accepted the loss was deserved. Caleb watched him go and felt complicated emotions he couldn't name: pity, understanding, and fierce gratitude that the man had chosen acceptance over fight. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The girls ran ahead, their earlier fear transforming into wild relief, laughing and spinning in the street like they'd just been freed from prison. "You did good in there," Brennan said, gathering his papers. "The bit about earning it through patience rather than law, that swayed Morrison. He respects that kind of wisdom." "Wasn't wisdom, just truth." Caleb watched the girls, his chest tight with emotions he'd spent 20 years learning to suppress. Carver might be their father by blood, but he hasn't earned the right to be their papa. That's something you build day by day, choice by choice. You've certainly built it. Those girls worship you. They trust me. That's different and harder to earn. Caleb turned to the lawyer. "What happens now? Paperwork, fees, official documentation?" "All of that, but it's just formality. The hard part's done." Brennan smiled. "Congratulations, Mr. Rourke. You're officially a father again." The words hit differently than they should have, not as a replacement for what he'd lost, but as something new, separate, equally precious. Emma would always be his daughter, Sarah would always be his wife, and those losses would always hurt. But Mara and Elin had carved out their own space in his heart, one that didn't diminish what came before, but existed alongside it. You could lose everything and still find something worth keeping. You could bury your heart and still have it wake up. You could run from connection for decades and still have it catch you when you weren't looking. Martha emerged from the courthouse, her eyes red, but her smile genuine. "I'm proud of you, Rourke. You turned into the man Catherine saw that day she asked for your promise. I just did what needed doing. That's what makes it noble, doing what needs doing without requiring recognition or reward." Martha glanced at the girls who were examining a storefront window display. "What will you tell them about Carver? About the possibility he's their father?" "The truth, eventually, when they're ready to hear it. But that's a conversation for later, when things have settled." Caleb pulled on his gloves against the cold. "For now, we're just going home." Home. The word felt different than it had 6 weeks ago, when home had meant isolation and silence and safety through disconnection. Now it meant noise and questions and two small voices calling for him when they needed something. It meant responsibility and vulnerability and the constant low-level terror of caring about people who could be lost. It also meant laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent too long. It meant someone waiting when he came back from checking trap lines. It meant mattering to someone beyond just himself. The ride back to the cabin took 3 hours, the winter sun sinking toward the peaks as they climbed into the high country. The girls chattered the whole way, about the judge, the courtroom, Martha's testimony, everything they'd seen and heard. Their relief expressed itself in words that tumbled over each other, in laughter that rang clear in the cold air. Caleb let them talk, occasionally answering questions, but mostly just listening to the sound of children who felt safe enough to process trauma through conversation. It was healthy, this talking through fear after the fact. Emma had done the same thing after thunderstorms or bad dreams, and watching Mara and Elin do it now felt like memory, and present blending together. The cabin appeared as dusk settled over the valley, smoke rising from the banked fire, lamplight glowing in windows that Caleb had left oil burning in despite the expense. He'd wanted light to welcome them home, wanted warmth and brightness waiting instead of cold darkness. Inside, everything was exactly as they'd left it that morning. Breakfast dishes washed and put away, the girls' beds made, books stacked neatly on the shelf. It looked like a home, smelled like a home, felt like a home in ways that had nothing to do with structure and everything to do with the people who lived there. "Papa?" Elin said, the word still new enough to make Caleb's breath catch. "Can we celebrate? Make something special for dinner?" "Papa?" She'd used it naturally, without asking permission first, claiming the title as her right. And Mara hadn't corrected her, had just looked at Caleb to see if he'd accept it. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "Let's celebrate. We'll make that stew you like, and there's cornbread fixings. Maybe even break out some of the preserves Martha brought last week." They cooked together, the small kitchen crowded with 3 people but managing. Caleb had learned to work around the girls, to coordinate tasks so everyone contributed without getting in each other's way. They developed rhythms, patterns, the small choreography of people who lived together and knew each other's movements. Over dinner, Mara finally asked the question Caleb had been waiting for. "Papa, do you think Deputy Carver really is our father?" Caleb set down his spoon, giving the question the consideration it deserved. "Honestly, probably. Timeline matches, physical resemblance is there, and your mother's behavior makes sense if she was running from someone specific, but probably isn't certain, and certain matters when it comes to family." "Would it change things if we knew for sure?" "Would it change how I feel about you? No. Would it give Carver legal rights he doesn't have now? Possibly. Would it change who you are or what you need? Not at all." Caleb met both girls' eyes. Blood is just one kind of connection. It matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. What matters is who shows up, who stays, who chooses you every day. "You chose us," Elin said softly. "You chose me too. That first morning when you could have refused to come with me, could have fought or argued. You chose trust. That's a gift I don't take lightly." "What if he wants to visit?" Mara asked. "What if he comes around trying to be our father?" "Then we handle it together. If you want to know him, to hear his stories about your mother, to understand that part of your history, I won't stop you. But if you don't, if you'd rather leave that door closed, I'll support that too." Caleb reached across the table, covering both their small hands with his scarred, calloused ones. "The judge gave me guardianship, but he gave you something more important, choice. You get to decide what family means, who belongs in it, how much room you make for the past versus the future." Mara squeezed his hand. "I think maybe someday I want to know. Not now, not for a while, but eventually, just to understand Mama better, to know what she ran from and why. That's fair. And when you're ready, we'll arrange it proper, supervised, safe, on your terms." Caleb looked at Elin. "What about you?" "I don't know yet. I'm still figuring out how to be your daughter. Adding another father seems complicated." Elin's young face scrunched with thought. "But Mara's right that it might help us understand Mama, so maybe someday." "Someday is good. Someday gives everyone time to grow into what needs to happen." Caleb released their hands, picking up his spoon again. "For now, let's just be what we are. 3 people who found each other when we all needed finding, who built something from nothing, who became family because we chose it." After dinner, they sat by the fire with the book of folktales, taking turns reading aloud. The girls' reading had improved dramatically under Martha's instruction, their confidence growing with each successfully navigated paragraph. When they stumbled, Caleb helped. When they succeeded, he praised. It was ordinary, this evening routine, almost boring in its predictability, and it was the most precious thing Caleb had experienced in 20 years. Later, after the girls had climbed to their beds and settled into sleep, Caleb sat at his table with the locket Catherine had carried. He opened it, studying the 2 painted faces, Catherine young and hopeful, the man beside her unidentifiable, without context. "I'm keeping my promise," he said quietly to her portrait. "They're safe, they're together, they're loved. That's what you asked for, and that's what I'm giving them." He closed the locket and set it aside. Tomorrow, he'd give it to Mara, let her decide whether to keep it, display it, or pack it away. It was their history, their connection to a mother who'd sacrificed everything to protect them. But it was also proof of a past that couldn't be changed, only understood and integrated. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the pines with the voice of winter. Snow began to fall, thick flakes that would probably accumulate overnight. Another storm coming, another test of their preparedness and resilience. But inside the cabin, warmth held against the cold. Light pushed back the darkness, and three people who'd been strangers 6 weeks ago slept as family, bound by choice and circumstance, and the stubborn refusal to give up on each other. The weeks after the hearing settled into a new kind of normal. Winter deepened its grip on the mountains, sealing them into their small valley with snow and cold. But isolation felt different now, not lonely but cozy, not empty but full. Martha continued her weekly visits, weather permitting, though she'd begun staying overnight when conditions looked threatening. She'd moved into the cabin gradually, bringing her belongings piece by piece as Roy sold off the inn's assets to pay his debts. Caleb had offered her the loft while he took the floor near the stove, an arrangement that made practical sense and gave the girls another adult presence. Spring came late that year, reluctantly releasing winter's hold. But when it finally arrived, it transformed the valley from white silence to green chaos. Wildflowers exploding in meadows, streams rushing with snowmelt, animals emerging from hibernation to reclaim their territory. The girls had grown over the winter, both physically and in confidence. Mara could run a trapline solo now, could read weather signs that Caleb had taken years to learn. Elin had discovered a gift for drawing, filling precious paper with sketches of animals and plants and the mountain vista from their porch. They'd become mountain children, comfortable in the wilderness, capable in ways that would serve them for life. But they'd also remain children, still needing guidance, still making mistakes, still learning what it meant to be part of something larger than themselves. One morning in late April, a rider appeared on the trail, Deputy Carver on a dark bay, moving slowly enough to be seen from a distance. He stopped at the property line, not approaching until Caleb stepped out to acknowledge him. "Morning, Rourke," Carver called. "Got a minute?" Caleb walked down to meet him, aware of the girls watching from the window. "What brings you up here, Deputy?" "Not deputy anymore. Resigned my position last month. Seemed like staying on was just torturing myself, seeing reminders of what I'd lost." Carver dismounted, his movements careful, non-threatening. "I'm heading to California. Friend offered me work on his ranch, and I figured a fresh start might do me good." "That's probably wise." "Yeah, but I couldn't leave without—" Carver trailed off, looking toward the cabin. "Without saying goodbye, I guess. To them, if they'll see me. To you, if they won't." Caleb studied the man before him. Carver looked different than he had in the courtroom, less rigid, more human, worn down by circumstances he couldn't control. The anger was gone, replaced by something like acceptance. "Wait here," Caleb said. "I'll ask them." Inside, the girls stood at the window, their expressions wary. "He wants to say goodbye. He's leaving the territory heading to California. Says he won't come back." Caleb kept his voice neutral. "You don't have to see him if you don't want. I can send him away." Mara and Elin looked at each other, that wordless twin communication passing between them. Finally, Mara nodded. "We'll see him, but you have to stay." "I'm not going anywhere." They walked out together, the girls flanking Caleb like soldiers taking protection from a commanding officer. Carver watched them approach, his face carefully neutral except for his eyes, which held a grief that made Caleb's chest ache in sympathy. "Girls," Carver said quietly, "I wanted to say goodbye before I left, and I wanted to give you something." He pulled an envelope from his coat, worn and creased from handling. "These are letters your mother wrote me before things went bad, back when we were happy, when she still believed in us. I thought maybe you'd want them someday, to know what she was like when she was young and in love." Mara took the envelope cautiously, as if it might burn. "Why are you giving these to us?" "Because they're yours by right. Because your mother was an incredible woman who deserved better than what I gave her. Because I want you to know she was happy once, even if I couldn't keep her that way." Carver's voice roughened. "And because I'm letting go. The judge was right. I haven't earned the right to be your father, and chasing that dream is just hurting everyone." "You could have tried," Elin said suddenly. could have stopped drinking sooner, could have been better before Mama had to run. You're absolutely right. I could have and should have done 100 things differently, but I didn't, and that's something I have to live with. Carver crouched down to their level, his movement slow and respectful. For what it's worth, I'm proud of you both. You're strong, smart, brave. Your mother did that, raised you to be survivors. And Rourke's building on that foundation, teaching you to thrive instead of just survive. That's more than I could have given you. He stood, extended his hand to Caleb. Take care of them. And thank you for being the man I couldn't be. Caleb shook the offered hand, feeling the finality in Carver's grip. Good luck in California. Yeah, I'll need it. Carver swung back onto his horse, gathered the reins, then paused. One more thing, I tracked down the death certificate. The real James Ross, the one Catherine claimed was her husband, died in a logging accident in Montana 9 years ago. She borrowed his name and story, used it to create a new identity. So legally, you're clear. No one's going to challenge your guardianship based on paternal rights. The information settled like a weight lifting. No more shadows, no more threats to what they'd built. Just clean, clear legal standing. Thank you for that, Caleb said. Carver nodded, touched his hat brim in farewell, and rode away. They watched until he disappeared around the bend, swallowed by distance and the forest. Do you think he'll be okay? Elin asked quietly. I think he'll survive. Whether he finds happiness depends on whether he can forgive himself. Caleb put a hand on each girl's shoulder. Sometimes the hardest person to make peace with is the one in the mirror. That night they sat together and read Catherine's letters. They were beautiful, full of hope and humor, and the voice of a woman who'd believed in love and possibility. They showed a side of their mother the girls had never seen, young, carefree, passionate about life. She sounds so different, Mara said, wonder in her voice. So light. That's who she was before life got hard, before she had to run, had to protect you, had to survive instead of live. Caleb carefully refolded one of the letters. But the woman who wrote these is the same woman who fought for you until her last breath. She just had to become something harder to keep you safe. I wish we could have known this version, Elin said softly. You did, in small ways. Every time she laughed at something silly, every time she made a game out of work, every time she chose joy despite circumstances. That was the girl from these letters showing through. Caleb gathered the letters together, handed them back to Mara. Keep these safe. They're proof that your mother loved deeply, even when that love didn't work out the way she hoped. Summer arrived in full glory, transforming the valley into something from a painting. Caleb taught the girls to fish, to track game, to read the mountain with the skill that came from decades of observation. They learned to work pelts, to garden in the short growing season, to preserve food against the winter that would inevitably return. They also learned town, making regular trips down for supplies and socializing. The girls attended church socials, made friends with other children, slowly integrated into the community that Caleb had avoided for so long. People got used to seeing the mountain hermit with 2 daughters, stopped staring, started treating them as just another family. And they were a family in all the ways that mattered. They fought and made up, learned each other's boundaries, developed the private language and inside jokes that came from living together. They became something organic and real, not defined by law or blood, but by daily choice and commitment. One August evening, as the sun painted the peaks in shades of amber and rose, Caleb sat on the porch watching the girls play in the meadow below the cabin. They were chasing butterflies, laughing at their failures to catch anything, just being the children they deserved to be. Martha joined him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She'd stayed on after winter, finding purpose in helping raise the girls, finding peace in the mountains after years of struggle in town. She and Caleb had developed an easy partnership, not romantic, just 2 people who understood each other's losses and respected each other's strengths. You did good, Rourke, she said, settling into the chair beside him. We did good. Couldn't have managed without you. Maybe. But you're the one who answered when they needed someone. You're the one who kept the promise. She sipped her coffee, watching the girls with maternal fondness. Catherine knew what she was doing when she chose you. She chose desperation. I just happened to be the one available. No, she chose character, saw something in you that you didn't see in yourself. Martha smiled. And she was right. You were exactly what those girls needed, someone steady and honest who wouldn't quit when things got hard. Down in the meadow, Elin finally caught a butterfly, cupping it gently in her hands to examine before releasing it unharmed. Her delighted laugh carried up the slope, a sound that never failed to make Caleb smile. "You know what the best part is?" Martha asked. "What?" "You're happy. For the first time since I've known you, you're actually happy instead of just surviving." Caleb considered this. Was he happy? The words seemed inadequate for what he felt. This complicated mix of contentment and anxiety, joy and responsibility, peace and constant low-level terror of loss. But underneath all the complexity was something simple and true. He was home. Not in a place, but in a life. Not alone, but surrounded by people who mattered. Not running from the past, but building toward a future. "Yeah," he admitted, "I am." As autumn painted the valley in scarlet and gold, preparing the mountains for another winter, life continued in its patterns. The girls started formal school in town, riding down twice a week with Martha to attend lessons with other children. They complained about the work, bragged about their grades, brought home projects that decorated the cabin walls. Caleb sold his furs for good prices, invested in improvements to the cabin. A larger stove, better windows, a second loft for when the girls got older and needed separate space. He was building for permanence now, not just survival. And on a crisp October morning when the first snow dusted the peaks, Caleb found himself standing at the small cemetery behind the church in town. He hadn't been there since arriving in Wyoming 20 years ago, hadn't been to any cemetery since burying his first family. But today he stood before a simple marker that read Catherine Ross, beloved mother, 1798-1825. The town had paid for it, a collective gesture of respect for a woman who died far from home. Someone had planted wildflowers around it, now faded with approaching winter. "I kept my promise," Caleb said to the marker. "They're safe, they're together, they're loved. More than that, they're thriving. Mara's fierce and smart, already planning how she'll run her own trapline someday. Elin's gentle and artistic, sees beauty in everything. They're becoming exactly who they're meant to be." He paused, searching for more words. "I didn't think I could do this. Thought that part of me died with Emma. But your girls woke something up, reminded me that hearts can heal if you let them, that love doesn't replace itself but adds on, grows bigger instead of dividing." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow and pine. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called. "They asked about you yesterday. Wanted to know if you'd be proud of them. I told them you'd be more than proud. You'd be amazed. Because they took everything you gave them. Strength, resilience, love, and they're building something beautiful from it." Caleb pulled a folded paper from his pocket, one of Elin's drawings, this one showing the cabin nestled in the valley with smoke rising from the chimney and 3 figures on the porch. She'd labeled it home in careful letters. He tucked it under a rock at the base of the marker, a gift from daughter to mother across the boundary of death. "Thank you," he said finally, "for trusting me, for seeing something I couldn't see, for giving me a reason to be more than I was." He left the cemetery as snow began to fall in earnest, walking back toward the life waiting for him. The girls would be home from school soon, full of stories about their day. Martha would have dinner started, filling the cabin with the smells of cooking. The evening would pass in reading and conversation and the comfortable silence of people who belonged together. Winter would come, as it always did. The mountains would test them with cold and storms and the 100 small crises that defined life in the high country. But they'd face it together, as a family, with strength drawn from each other rather than isolation. Caleb Rourke had spent 20 years learning to survive alone. Now he was learning something harder and infinitely more rewarding. How to live together. How to love without the guarantee of forever. How to build a family from the broken pieces of other lives. And in the cabin that had once been a hermit's refuge and was now a home, 2 girls who'd been lost and then found waited for the man who'd become their father. Not through blood or law, though those had come eventually, but through choice made daily in 1,000 small acts of showing up and staying and refusing to give up on each other. That was family. That was home. That was everything that mattered, reduced to its essential truth. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.